Disclaimer. This video contains spoilers for these Christopher Nolan movies. There are time codes in the description if you want to jump around. We all good? Fantastic. Now, start the clock. Tick, tock, tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound of time. It can be a bit unnerving hearing it like that, can it? To hear each second go by, to be hyper-aware of time passing before your eyes. Time is one of the major constants in a Christopher Nolan movie. Some might even say it is the constant. He might be stretching it, he might be compressing it, he might even be reversing it. And in each of these cases, he's using it to sometimes dramatically horrifying effects. A character might lose 23 years of time and have to immediately grapple with the weight of never getting those years back. Time is as much an adversary as anything. Stopping the villains on time, getting off a specific planet on time, escaping the beach on time. But it also extends to the narrative structure. Stories can be told in a million different orders, and to Nolan, perhaps the least interesting order of all is linear. That perhaps narratives could be split across time, scenes could be split across time. There's an experimental element that stretches back to the silent era and to the age of movies before television. There are a million ways to tell a story, and to Nolan, one of the things that movies are fantastic at doing is manipulating and bending time.
I'm not afraid of death. I'm an old physicist. I'm afraid of time.
The year is 1977, and a young Christopher Nolan has just been given his first camera. A Super 8 film camera borrowed from his father was able to capture roughly 2.5 minutes of footage that allowed Nolan to film shorts and find his way around movie making. Super 8, of course, was special for its smaller perforations along the side compared to regular 8mm film, allowing the image to take up more of the strip itself. Born in the United Kingdom in 1970, Christopher Nolan was always caught between two worlds. He was raised and educated in the UK, but spent plenty of vacation time in the United States. His father, an Englishman, worked in advertising as a creative director, and his mother, an American, was a flight attendant turned English teacher. Nolan himself has split so much between his UK and US history that he in fact has dual citizenship in both countries. But since he went to school in the UK, he has maintained his characteristic English accent, something that wasn't the same for his younger brother Jonathan, who went to school in the United States. But it was these journeys to the US that opened up many doors for the young Nolan. While visiting the country, he was exposed in pretty major ways to movies. And of course, there was really no better movie to kickstart a love of the art form quite like... Released in 1977, Star Wars was influential to millions upon millions of people, and with Christopher Nolan being just 7 years old when it was taking over the world, it was foundational. In fact, his first ever films shot on Super 8 were space movies, reverse engineering what made Star Wars work using Star Wars action figures to create a series of shorts called Space Wars. But Nolan's influences would only grow after that. 2001: A Space Odyssey would be an enormous influence, with its slower pace, more methodical tone, and some surrealist images. It was a transformative experience. James Bond would be hugely influential, the Roger Moore era specifically becoming defining blockbusters for the time. Literature would also make its way into Nolan's influences, as he constantly looked back towards classic literature by authors like Edgar Allan Poe. There's perhaps no greater influence than the paintings of M.C. Escher, featuring their twisty, impossible geometry. Christopher Nolan and others would remark that it's like if art was crossed with mathematics. And the novel Waterland, written by Graham Swift, can be credited for inspiring Christopher Nolan to explore different ways of telling stories. Crucially, it sparked his interest in telling stories in a non-linear chronology. You know, out of order. That things didn't have to play out in a certain order. You could turn things around on themselves and do something potentially more interesting if you reorganized it. And eventually, two of the most formative movies on Nolan's life were Alien and Blade Runner. Now, these are two very different movies for a lot of reasons, but Nolan noticed similarities, common threads that link them together, because both movies are directed by Ridley Scott. This was a huge stepping stone for Nolan, understanding that even two movies with completely different stories could have similarities because of the person at the top of the food chain. The director had a lot of control over whatever movie they were making, and they could draw thematic lines between any of their movies. More than anything else, this gave Nolan the spark to direct his very own movies. Though of course at such a young age, no one's going to write movies for him to direct, so he had to do that part too. But that wasn't too much of a problem. It became another aspect of the process Nolan really enjoyed. Breaking stories, figuring them out, having that control from minute one. Over the years, Nolan would constantly be upgrading his craft, trying out new things, trying to grow and be better with every attempt. There was never a period of his life where filmmaking wasn't somehow a part of it. Eventually, in 1989, at just 19 years old, he teamed up with Adrian and Rocco Bellic to direct his first credited short film, Tarantella. This was a surreal, almost horror-like short, complete with bizarre imagery of spiders, roadways, even playing around with reversing footage. This was certainly rough around the edges, but had plenty of interesting ideas, and successfully got the viewer to question what was real and what wasn't. The main character appears to wake up at the very beginning, but with the amount of surrealist images afterwards, the question is, did he actually wake up? Or is the spider controlling him? Maybe. I don't know. Perhaps surprisingly, Christopher Nolan never went to film school, though that wasn't for the lack of trying. He tried to get into the National Film and Television School in Beaconsfield and the Royal College of Art in London, but he wasn't able to get into either. Instead, he chose to study English literature at the University College London, or UCL, specifically to broaden his horizons to study something not explicitly tied to filmmaking, but that could give him an edge when the time came. But he also discovered that UCL had its own filmmaking facilities, 16mm cameras and a Steenbeck editing suite. Upon this discovery, Christopher Nolan worked with his at-the-time girlfriend and eventual wife, Emma Thomas, to kickstart the Union's Film Society, and from 1992 to 1994 he served as its president. Together they'd meet plenty of other film enthusiasts as they screened 35mm films every week, all to help fund the 16mm equipment. After graduation, Christopher Nolan worked as a cameraman for the industrial film company Electric Airwaves, making his rent working on training films. But ultimately, Nolan wanted to make his own movies. No matter what, he wanted to be able to do his own thing. So, as the 90s continued, he was able to reassemble some of his friends from the Film Society and create two short films. The first was titled Larceny, starring Nolan's friend Jeremy Theobald, though outside of a single screening at the Cambridge Film Festival in July 1996, it has never been released publicly. All anyone knows is from secondhand information, revealing that the story had something to do with burglary. But the next short would eventually be seen by the world at large, as in the year 1997, Christopher Nolan teamed up with Jeremy Theobald once again for the short film Doodlebug. A quick 3-minute short about a man rushing around his house to squash a bug, complete with unnerving music by David Julian, quickly acquired yet great-looking insert shots, and even a twist, as it is eventually discovered that the bug the man is hunting for is a smaller version of himself. And once he's finally caught it, he becomes the bug for the next level up. In the grand scheme of things, it might not seem like there's a lot to go off of here, but it managed to reveal a spark with Christopher Nolan. It managed to reveal that there was something here that could grow and expand over time. Now, both of these shorts were captured over the course of a weekend and edited across the following week. They were shot and put together very quickly. But that gave Nolan the confidence to take the next big leap. If they could make a quick 3 to 5 minute short in a weekend, they could extend that process to film 3 to 5 minutes every weekend. And all of that could be stitched together to create the ultimate project any aspiring director dreams to make. Stitch enough weekends together and you have yourself a feature film. This is where our journey begins. The journey of a filmmaker who rose from obscurity to become one of the defining voices of the 21st century. From being an indie darling to one of the most popular blockbuster filmmakers around, this is where we chronicle the journey of the one, the only, If you're enjoying the video so far, subscribe to the channel. It helps out a lot. Alright, we can't keep thinking of time linearly, so let's keep this moving. Throughout the 90s, Nolan and producing partner Emma Thomas had a number of ideas when it came to making a more long-form project. In fact, they very nearly got something off the ground with the film Larry Mahoney, a story about a student posing as other people. Plenty of footage was shot, but they discovered that the technical limitations just wound up hitting them a little too hard, and they were never able to actually finish the project. But it wouldn't be much longer before more ideas struck Christopher Nolan, 2 in particular. Since he was living in the west side of London in a very populated area, Nolan was right in the middle of crowds walking down the street, people going to and from wherever they were. And something that he often did was try and single out a single person among that crowd. By doing that, suddenly the crowd disappears, and you're watching one person live their life, going about their day. He would never follow them, but it was an interesting experiment to suddenly see a single person amongst the crowd living their life and going about their business even in such a crowded setting. And at the same time, he was burgled. Not too much was stolen, some personal items and CDs, but the thing that struck Nolan the most was the violation of privacy. The thing that really keeps people out of breaking into houses isn't necessarily the door, it's the social protocol. A wordless agreement we all make to say, yeah, that's your house, I won't go in there without permission. But burglary broke that agreement. It broke societal norms. In the same way, singling out one person amongst the crowd and focusing on what they were doing kind of broke societal norms. There was something linking these two notions, something that Nolan believed could be very interesting to explore, which gave way to the script for his very first feature film, Following. Written by Nolan himself, the script stretched to a whopping 86 pages in length, which, if we use the basic math of 1 page equals 1 minute of screen time, would land the finished movie somewhere around 86 minutes. While it was extremely ambitious to make a feature film, Nolan made sure to keep it as slim and short as possible. They weren't making a 3-hour epic, they were making something quick and scrappy. Though of course even something quick and scrappy at this stage of the game was gonna take a while. Filming took place over the course of a year. The cast and crew would assemble on Saturdays to film 15 minutes of footage a day. Each and every one of them, including Christopher Nolan, had jobs during the week, so they could only assemble on weekends to film the scenes. Nolan would then use the following week to edit whatever they had. Like in the previous 2 shorts, Jeremy Theobald would star as the main character, though this time he would also serve as a producer and help bring on some of his actor friends to take on the other roles, namely Alex Haw as the character Cobb and Lucy Russell, known only in the story as the Blonde. Following was shot on 16mm black and white film, mostly to save on cost. In fact, the entire budget was spent on purchasing and processing the film itself. The budget added up to roughly £3,000 or about $6,000 US. Shooting on color would have increased the price of both the film stock and the processing quite significantly. Not to mention they'd have to modify their lighting setups. But with black and white film, they didn't have to worry if the colors would match, because there was no color. Nolan's experience working on training videos actually taught him a lot about setting up shots very quickly, using the limited resources to put something together very, very fast and get it in front of a camera. Most of the movie was shot handheld, natural lighting was used at every turn, they didn't have any permits for locations, they shot at places based on favors and friends. A lot of the movie was shot at Nolan's parents' house or Jeremy Theobald's own flat, without even changing much of what was inside, keeping the details as close to what they were in real life to give it that sense of authenticity. Then, on top of that, they went fully guerrilla when filming on the street, just capturing the streets of London as they were during the day. One scene, however, was shot at the UCL Film Society, using the dolly they had on site. This scene even starred Christopher Nolan's uncle, John Nolan, who was an actor himself working in the industry for decades. He even gave Nolan key tips and insights into how best to work with actors. The biggest hurdle, though, came in the fact that since the film stock was as expensive as it was, the crew needed to make sure they used it as efficiently as possible. So, most every shot had to be done on the first take, with rare examples of second takes across the shoot. The actors went through extensive rehearsals before shooting, almost going through the process of making a stage play, where you never get a second take, you just have to go through the scene right then and there. It was a long, arduous process, filming small pieces of the movie every weekend, trying to make sure things matched up as best as they could. But they did have the bragging rights to say that the entire cast, crew, and equipment could fit into one London taxi to get to whatever location they were filming next. next. Truly small-scale, no-budget filmmaking, which all led to the year 1998. Where the film would finally wrap production. After a year of assembling on weekends, the entire film was captured. It just needed the final steps in the editing suite to put it all together. Now, given the lack of money, Nolan opted not to cut the movie on film, since printing that and a negative would prove to be too expensive. Instead, he cut it on pneumatic tape, before working with editor Gareth Heel to do a rough sound mix and more or less finalize the cut, landing the movie at a 70-minute runtime. Which brought along perhaps the most daunting question: how are people gonna see it? In essence, Nolan and company were coming from nothing, from nowhere. They had made this movie without permits and without connections, so how are they going to get it in front of an audience? Well, you have to go through the only channel there is to get your film shown to people at this scale: the festival circuit. The challenge was, the British festival circuit was very hard to break into. They weren't as keen on getting films that came from nowhere. You usually needed some kind of established connection to be able to get in the door. The British film industry just wasn't built to support Nolan's movie the way that he might have wanted. So the team had to turn their sights towards the United States, which of course had its own monstrous festival circuit and a lot more hunger for new up-and-coming voices that maybe hadn't been seen before. So, thankfully, after having turned their sights to the US, Nolan and company were able to land at the San Francisco International Film Festival, where they were even able to get some support to create a 16mm print of the finished movie. And it was just enough of a push through the door to get the movie in front of people for the very first time. After a year of shooting, after decades of improving his craft, Christopher Nolan now had his very first feature film. And the very first screening was finally held on April 24th, 1998, where in San Francisco, festival attendees were able to catch the first look at the work of this new up-and-coming filmmaker. I'm not the first person to point this out, but it's quite funny that the first spoken line of dialogue in this movie is...
"The following is my explanation."
Following follows a character known only as Bill. If that really is his name, we don't actually know. He's only credited as the young man, but for now we'll call him Bill. He's a young writer trying to get ideas for his next novel and has chosen his inspiration as the people of London. That's right, when out and about in the city, he will randomly choose a person amidst the crowd and follow them, seeing where they go, how they live their life, and then... nothing. He'll leave them be. He's even set up a rule that he never follows anyone twice. He's deliberately breaking social norms and barriers to find inspiration, information, anything for his novel. That is until he breaks his most important rule. He begins to follow this man, Cobb, a second time. And of course, he gets caught, which only brings him further into a darker world of his own undoing. Because you see, Cobb is a burglar.
You don't look like a burglar. Sounds like a compliment.
And he begins to rope Bill into the weird and strange world of breaking into people's houses to steal their belongings and encroach on their property. And as the movie continues, we see Bill gain a taste for burglary, a taste for breaking these societal norms, and it only begins to unravel him from there. He eventually gets involved with a blonde woman who is only known as the Blonde, which begins to tear apart Bill's life even further. And overall, it makes for an alright movie. Sitting at 70 minutes, this movie does not outstay its welcome. It's in and it's out in very, very good time. The cast is also quite solid, though interestingly of the main players, only Lucy Russell, who plays the Blonde, continued to have a professional acting career. Alex Haw, who plays Cobb, moved to Australia as this movie wrapped to become an architect, and Jeremy Theobald, who plays Bill, went on to become an editor. But that doesn't stop their performances from fitting right in with what this movie is trying to do. There are definitely technical limitations on the movie. It's quite clear that they really had no financial backing whatsoever. Everything outside of the book-ending scenes in the police station is shot handheld. The audio is a little rough at times, some dialogue is muffled, which makes it harder to hear, and you can even hear the film moving through the camera during a few brief moments. But the movie manages to make the most of what it has. The crew deliberately set the opening of the movie inside of the police station, shot at the UCL Film Society, so that the audio at the start start would be as clean as possible. That way, the audience would be able to get invested in the story before the rest of the audio, which wasn't as good, could turn them away. And the music helps during plenty of moments. Composed by David Julian, it's quite a surreal type of score, with high-pitched squeal-like tracks coupled with a trademarked pulsating low-pitch hum.
See? Nobody home.
And at the same time, the movie is quite sure-footed in what it wants to tackle, specifically in the script. Given that the inspiration is all about breaking societal barriers by both following and burglarizing people, the movie opens doors into the exact morality and motivations behind why Cobb does what he does. It's not just about breaking in, stealing stuff, then turning a profit from it. He's also interested in the impact it could have on whoever he's stealing from.
Like when they go back and buy all this stuff from the shelves of the insurance money, they'll have to think for the first time in a long time why they wanted all this stuff, what it's for. You take it away, you show them what they had.
But by far the most interesting part of the movie is its structure. This movie tells its story non-linearly, meaning it's all out of order. You spend some time over here, you spend some time over there, and maybe a bit over here too. There are 3 storylines running concurrently. You have Cobb teaching Bill about how to be a burglar, to do things the way he does. You have Bill getting into a relationship with the blonde, and finally you have Bill pulling off the most daring heist he's ever attempted. Really, the only indicator is how long Bill's hair is. Sometimes it's long, sometimes it's short, other times he's got a bruised face, and you gotta use the context clues to put together where each scene is in the timeline. It's like unraveling a conspiracy as you're watching the movie, or more accurately, it's like putting together a puzzle. Because that's the real kicker. The movie is actively demanding your engagement by making you put the pieces together. It's giving you all the ingredients, but you have to complete the recipe. You'll hear about an event at one point in the story, then during a later scene you'll actually see that event take place. The movie draws a bit of attention to it, but it's you pointing at the screen noticing the connection. I think this is what makes Following stand out. The interest in telling a story out of order. The movie is alright otherwise, but that is what brings it all together. The puzzle aspect, the idea of piecing it all together as it goes. It also gives you something to think about once it's all over, as you put the final pieces in place once the credits roll. And ultimately it all leads to the complete unraveling of Bill's life. Cobb has been training Bill to operate exactly as he does, using his same practices, his same strategies, everything. But it turns out to all be a ruse. Because Cobb is doing this to save his own skin. The police have suspected that Cobb has committed a murder at some point during one of his heists. Once they complete their puzzle, Cobb's gonna be done for. But if there's another man with his same tactics running around who doesn't know how to hide himself from that investigation, he'll be done for instead. And Cobb makes sure to cover his tracks. He suggests that Bill use a hammer to perform his heist, and to solidify everything, Cobb uses that same hammer to kill the blonde, the only other person who could incriminate him. As the pieces begin to fall into place at the end, you see just how Cobb managed to destroy any alibi Bill might have had to get away scot-free. So now, while Bill might be trying to confess his sins to the police to get them to go after Cobb, Cobb's already in the wind. Bill's going down, and Cobb is still out there as a mystery man getting away with all of it. Boom. It might not be the most original twist of all time, and the idea of a man disappearing amidst a crowd is certainly a shot that's been in movies many, many times, but it's an effective, twist-laden end to the story that flips things on its head and goes to show just how much Bill's life has been completely destroyed. So it's a solid first outing for Christopher Nolan, featuring an interesting narrative style, a brief appearance by Emma Thomas in the background early on, that's fun, and it got people at the festival talking. Reviews coming out of the festival circuit regarding this movie were very positive. While most noted the technical limitations and rough around the edges presentation, anyone who saw this movie agreed on one simple thing. This new filmmaker was someone to look out for. Following would continue to rush across the film festival circuit, traveling to Slamdance, Seattle, Florida, Toronto, Vancouver, and many other places around the world, with each showing gaining more eyes and more attention on this interesting and fresh neo-noir story. Before this, no one had ever heard of Christopher Nolan. No one had any expectation in what he was making or planning to do. But after seeing this debut, some people were suddenly paying attention. And as is common with the film festival circuit, especially for those who've had a majorly positive performance, they start wanting to fund future projects. So potential fundraisers began asking Nolan an incredibly important question. A question that can stump so many in his position. What was he going to do next? Luckily for Nolan, he had an answer.
For me, the process of choosing a project is all about story. Is this a story that hooks me, that I feel that I really have to tell?
Every Christopher Nolan movie, in a lot of ways, is built around some kind of concept, some kind of conceit that gives it a bit of life separate from what else is out there. Playing with memory, playing with time, playing with a larger-than-life world. And more often than not, these stories revolve around characters who make very key choices. Not just any kind of choice, whether to go left or right, but to actually grapple with something extraordinary and even questionable. Christopher Nolan wants to put you right next to this character, shoulder to shoulder, and get you to understand why they might make the choice they make, and then he'll make you ponder, should they have made that choice at all? Back in 1996, during a road trip with his brother Jonathan from Chicago to Los Angeles, Jonathan began to pitch an idea for a short story he had. A short story inspired by a topic that was covered in his psychology class, the topic of anterograde amnesia, a specific type of memory loss where you are unable to form new memories. Jonathan's story centered on a man with this particular type of amnesia, who would tattoo his body with vital information in the quest to find one man, John G., the man who raped and murdered his wife. A relatively simple story backed by an incredibly interesting concept. Nolan loved it and immediately thought it could make for a fantastic movie. So the two began developing their ideas independently of one another. Jonathan Nolan would work on the short story, while Christopher Nolan would work on the screenplay. The key difference between the two approaches, though, is that Christopher Nolan wanted to find a way to really get the audience into the main character's shoes, to get them to feel what he was feeling at any given moment. So what if the movie denied the audience the very same information that the character was denied? What if instead of a narrative that plays out traditionally, it plays out backwards, leaving you having to once again put the pieces together to understand the big picture? It was the exact hook that got Nolan working, writing through the screenplay which was now known as Memento. And it was thanks to Emma Thomas that the movie would get funding, as she managed to get the idea to Aaron Ryder of Newmarket Films, who loved the script. He decided to back the project with a whopping $4.5 million, an enormous leap from the $6,000 budget for Following. So, as Following was going through the festival circuit and getting its flowers, Nolan was working full tilt on his second feature film, taking him into the year 1999. One of the biggest departures from Following was that Nolan needed to find a cast that wasn't just people he knew at UCL, he needed to bring in paid actors, real paid actors. In fact, the initial push was to go fully A-list for the lead role, with Brad Pitt being eyed to star as the main character. But due to some scheduling conflicts, that never quite worked out. Some other names were floated around like Charlie Sheen, Alec Baldwin, Aaron Eckhart, Thomas Jane, but eventually, to save a little bit of money, the team decided to cast someone not quite as well known, which is where Guy Pearce comes in. Having starred in LA Confidential, he impressed Nolan the most out of anyone up for the role, and he won points for his lack of celebrity status at the time. And Guy Pearce himself loved the script, finding it different from anything else that was out there. The same could be said for the second lead, Carrie Ann Moss, who also impressed Nolan with her performance in The Matrix. In fact, it was her connections to that movie that brought on the third lead, Joe Pantoliano, who of course played Cypher in The Matrix. His joining managed to round out the central three characters, leaving the rest of the supporting cast to fill in rather quickly. All of which led to September 7th, 1999, where production would begin in Los Angeles, California. Originally, the crew was going to shoot in Montreal, but in an effort to find a more noirish look, Los Angeles became the way to go. shooting in Burbank, Pasadena, and Sunland for a grand total of 27 days. A very brief, very breezy production that went about as smoothly as you can imagine. But the real kicker was that this was the biggest leap of Nolan's career. Instead of shooting on weekends with friends, getting locations as favors from other friends, he was now working with a paid cast of actors on someone else's dime, and he was working with a cinematographer. For all of his previous projects, his short films, following, Nolan shot them himself. He was manning the camera, capturing the images. Of course, this is a necessity when you have no money, but it's quite uncommon once you get into bigger productions like this. So this time he brought in cinematographer Wally Pfister. The two had met during a film festival. Wally needed work, and Nolan needed a cinematographer for his next movie. So things managed to work out perfectly for them to team up for this movie. While Following was shot on black and white 16mm film, Memento was shot on 35mm color film, with some sequences still being shot in black and white. Now, there had been suggestions at the time that Super 35mm film was going to be the way of the future, that it was going to be the next advancement that everyone needed to get in on. In fact, the last few James Cameron movies shot on Super 35mm. But Nolan, knowing enough about the ins and outs of film cameras, didn't quite believe that. He still knew that standard 35mm anamorphic was the best format to capture these kinds of images. Which is why, despite suggestions from others, Nolan stuck to his guns and shot on 35mm anamorphic film. Now I know what you're thinking. What's anamorphic? Well, it's a specific type of lens. Most lenses are circular on the outside and on the inside, but on an anamorphic lens, the glass inside is elliptical. It's an oval shape. This compresses the light from the outside, compressing the image onto the film itself. That way, you can still use every single inch of the film strip and then stretch it out again through an anamorphic projector to get the standard 2.39:1 cinematic aspect ratio with the black bars on the top and bottom. It also gives the film some distinct characteristics like long horizontal blue lens flares, and instead of circular light flares in the distance, they're ovals. For many reasons, Nolan has cited this movie as the single biggest leap of his career, the most enormous jump he had ever undertaken between two movies, and it was a lot to take on. But the production went smoothly. The shoot lasted until October 8th, 1999, where cameras were put away for the last time. But while Memento had wrapped production, that didn't mean the journey was over for Following. In fact, thanks to the festival circuit, Following managed to get distribution. The movie was picked up by Zeitgeist Film, who gave the movie a theatrical run in the UK. They even released a brief trailer for the movie, featuring pull quotes from reviews across the festival run. The movie finally released in theaters on November 5th, 1999, nearly a year and a half after it was first shown at a festival. And it managed to rake in $50,000, which doesn't sound like a lot, but consider the fact that it only cost $6,000, that's a solid profit. And if I suddenly had $50,000 more in my pocket, that would be pretty sick, if I'm being honest. But that's not mainstream attention, which is totally fine. That movie was probably never going to get that level of mainstream attention, but with enough luck, the next one might. Unfortunately, there wasn't much luck to go around. After Memento was completed, it wound up being screened for distributors in March of 2000. This was going to be the big moment to get the movie sold and sent out to theaters. And luckily for the team, practically every distributor loved it. They couldn't stop singing Nolan's praises. But none of them bought it. Joe Pantoliano would even say that he spoke to many executives over the next while, hearing so many of them say they loved the movie, but wouldn't buy it. The main catch was that the distributors didn't think it could attract an audience. You could never sell it to enough people. It wasn't worth selling it to people, really. The movie remained in limbo for a long time, despite some pushes within the industry to get it distributed. But certain strides were accomplished during this time of uncertainty. Because of the many people who saw the movie, Steven Soderbergh was one of its biggest champions. He loved it. He couldn't speak highly enough about how much he loved it, and he was one of the biggest voices trying to get it distributed. While he was never successful in that aim, he was able to help Christopher Nolan in another way. Back in 1997, the Norwegian film Insomnia was released, starring Stellan Skarsgård in the lead role, a story of a detective called in to solve a murder in a small town in northern Norway, an area in which during this time of year the sun never sets, leaving the lead character unable to sleep while trying to solve the case. This was a movie that Nolan was a very big fan of. He was such a big fan, in fact, that the day he first watched it, he immediately went to see it a second time. There was something about the atmosphere, the noir-like story that really appealed to him. And as the 21st century was coming around the corner, Warner Brothers began looking into producing an American remake. Nolan himself tried to push to get into the conversation, but since he was practically a nobody, this never quite worked out. Instead, Jonathan Demme was approached to take on the project, with Harrison Ford in talks to star. But after seeing Memento, Steven Soderbergh used his influence to change Warner Brothers' mind. He encouraged, maybe even demanded, that they give this new filmmaker the time of day, that they open the floodgates and give Nolan his first studio feature. And with the promise that both Soderbergh and George Clooney would be executive producers, that was enough to get Warner Brothers on board. So, while the Jonathan Demme idea never panned out, the studio decided to take the riskier, more unknown option. They decided to give Christopher Nolan the reins on his first studio film, operating on a budget of $46 million. It was 10 times the size of Memento, another enormous leap, but it was just the right kicker to get Nolan into gear for his third feature film. And finally, while Insomnia was getting off the ground, Memento's time in unknown territory came to an end. After every distributor had turned the movie down, New Market Films, the same company that financed the production, decided to take matters into their own hands. It was a risky decision, but since they believed in the movie, they decided to distribute it themselves, putting their own money on the line to get the movie in front of audiences. Presumably to cut costs, or just because they were interested, a lot of the movie's marketing was taken on by Christopher Nolan and Jonathan Nolan themselves. Jonathan Nolan designed the film's official website, allowing you to interact with key elements from the movie to get introduced to some of the concepts in interesting ways. The website address was even cleverly named otnemem.com, which is Memento backwards. And Christopher Nolan edited the trailers himself, keeping the main conceit of the non-linear structure of the movie a secret, but selling the whole thing on the memory loss aspect and the main character's mission to find the killer of his wife. Even using clever text on screen to show how you simply can't trust anyone, that any information can be skewed in certain ways, and that without memory, it's hard to put the pieces together on your own.
I have no short-term memory. Since my injury, I can't make new memories. Everything fades. If we talk for too long, I'll forget how we started, and next time I see you, I'm not going to remember this conversation. I don't even know if I've met you before. I've told you this before, haven't I?
This trailer was aired on inexpensive cable channels like Bravo and A&E, alongside websites like Yahoo and MSN. It was enough to get the word out for those paying attention, and it all led to Nolan's second major festival circuit. With the movie ready to go, distribution underway, the movie went through a promotional circuit before its theatrical release, which all started at the Venice Film Festival. Attendees present surely had heard about Christopher Nolan, even if they hadn't seen Following, and many were interested to see what he had in store next. And it all finally led to September 5th, 2000, where, in Venice, those attending would be able to catch a glimpse of Christopher Nolan's second feature film. They would be able to see how he played with memory. Have you ever heard the story of Sammy Jankis? I mean, if you've seen this movie, you definitely have.
Have I told you about Sammy Jankis?
Yeah. I'm sick of hearing about the guy.
Sammy Jankis was a man with anterograde amnesia. He could never develop new memories after a certain point. He knew who he was, he could remember everything that happened before, but nothing after. His wife wanted the old Sammy back, wondering if there was any cure, any test that could bring him back. They even brought in an insurance investigator to help get to the bottom of everything. And this right here is the basis for the story of Leonard Shelby, another man with anterograde amnesia, caused the night someone broke into his house and killed his wife. Now he's on a quest for revenge. The key information is tattooed across his body with the central line, "John G. raped and murdered my wife." But what if Sammy's story is just Leonard's story? What if these are not two different people, but they're one and the same? What if this is a tale Leonard's been telling himself to disguise his own past so that he only remembers what he wants to? What if memory really is that pliable?
Look, memory can change the shape of a room, it can change the color of a car. And memories can be distorted. They're just an interpretation, they're not a record.
But this is just one of many ways Memento plays with your memory. This movie is constantly keeping you guessing. It's constantly keeping you on your toes, and it mainly accomplishes that with how it's structured. Most movies you watch play out linearly. They start at the beginning, they end at the end, and it takes you there in more or less a straight line. But Memento has two intercutting storylines, one of which is presented in black and white, a series of scenes that are playing in chronological order, and the other is presented in color, with each sequence presented in reverse order. So each new color sequence is actually the one that happened before the last one. There's even a scene right at the start that plays in reverse motion, though still using forward-playing sound effects to help give across this slight feeling of unease. This feeling that something's off before you piece it all together. There's even two different kinds of narration. The color sequences feature narration that sounds a lot like an internal monologue. You know, this is what's going on right in Leonard's head.
I don't feel drunk.
While the narration in the black and white sequences feels more like interview snippets, like he's answering questions for someone.
You really need a system if you're gonna make it work. You kind of learn to trust your own handwriting. That becomes an important part of your life.
What this structure does is it forces you to remember what came before. It forces you to be putting the pieces together at every moment, not unlike Following, but played up to the nth degree. The movie gives you the pieces, it lays everything out in front of you and gives you all the tools necessary to put them together, but you have to put them together yourself. All the while, it's also just throwing you into the weeds. When every color scene starts, you don't know what just happened, and neither does Leonard. You're right in his head, just waking up in a place and going on instinct to try and figure out what to do next, which also leads to some fun comedic moments.
Okay, so what am I doing? Oh, I'm chasing this guy. No, he's chasing me.
There's also this other bit that I find a lot of fun, when Leonard is being followed and downright harassed by someone on the road, leading to the two eventually pulling over.
What the fuck?
Just the hard cut to Leonard facing forward and driving away is really funny to me. It's so sudden, it's great. Now, a lot of this is helped by the editing. Dodie Dorn was the editor on this movie, and while the order of sequences is mostly dictated by the script, there are plenty of key editing choices that can be bridged in the cutting room. Flashbacks are a very significant part of the story, but they're only used at certain points. Any flashback to the Sammy Jenkins story is only told during the black and white sequences, while flashbacks to Leonard's wife are only told during the color sequences. But the real kicker that keeps the movie together is that each color sequence ends with the beginning of the previous scene. I know that's a lot to get your head around, but each scene ends with just the right amount of connective tissue so you know what comes next, all before you eventually rewind to find out what happened before. It's a really interesting way of putting it together, but it is the essential piece that allows you to put together not only what the movie is going for, but also the chronological series of events. But you don't just need to mentally put the movie together chronologically, because on the home release there's a special feature that allows you to watch the movie chronologically, which gives a very different experience. In the original version, the way we're introduced to other characters like Teddy and Natalie is quite startling. They just appear and both we and Leonard kinda have to go along with it. We have to assume that these characters have known each other for a while and that's why they keep popping up. Just like Leonard, who has to fake his knowledge of these people because to him, they've only existed for the past 5 minutes. He does, however, have key pieces of information on his Polaroids, which he takes throughout the movie. Pictures of each of the characters and vital information therein. Though there's interesting stuff there too. Like how when Teddy tries to get Leonard to be suspicious of Natalie, Leonard writes this note in completely different handwriting. You can only trust your own, and he doesn't want to trust this line. But the most significant note, the one that motivates the entire movie, is the note Leonard has for Teddy. Don't believe his lies.
You are full of shit.
But when you play the movie chronologically, while you lose the memory-bending aspects of the story, you get a completely different read on Teddy and Natalie. There's a lot more tragedy now since these are two characters who are simply manipulating Leonard to achieve their own ends. They're using his condition to their advantage, using him to do their dirty work, and it's nearly perfect since he will never remember. This is even brought up with Bert, who begins charging Leonard for a second room to try and see if he can squeeze him for all he's worth. Classic. But the hairpin structure, as Christopher Nolan once infamously drew out, is exactly what helps propel this movie. It takes this movie from already having an interesting concept and an interesting protagonist to something that genuinely plays with storytelling tricks. It's using the medium of film specifically to do something no other medium really can, at least not like this. It's carefully constructed, incredibly simple, and leaves you thinking long after it's over. And uncovering the information in reverse, learning all of these pieces of information in the most unconventional way, keeps you on your toes. The opening scene of the movie is Leonard killing Teddy, who we learn is actually John Edward Gamble, John G. We see that right out of the gate. We get that reveal in the first 10 minutes of the movie. So how does it manage to keep up the interest for the next 2 hours? Because the longer the movie goes, the more pieces are unveiled, all until the two timelines converge towards the end of the movie, sometime in the middle of the linear timeline. This is where we learn about many enormous things, like the idea that Leonard might just be Sammy Jankis, or the fact that Leonard actually killed the real John G a long time ago. It happened, it's over, and yet he forgot, so the mission continued. And maybe the reason his wife is dead isn't because of the attack, maybe the attack is just what killed his memory. Maybe it was his wife testing him by having him give her multiple insulin shots in a short time without him remembering. Did Leonard kill his wife? Has this whole quest been for naught? All this does is make Leonard angry. Really angry. Teddy's revealing all of this to him, and while it all makes some amount of sense, none of it makes sense. Which leads to the most crucial decision. Since Teddy is a John G, he is now the one Leonard is after. Leonard puts together all the necessary information, he sets the stage for his future self, even writing on the Polaroid, "Don't believe his lies." Which itself is a lie. Or at least a construction based not on facts, but on feelings. Because more than anyone else, Leonard knows how to manipulate his own memories. He's been doing it this entire time. What even is the truth? What is fact? Leonard becomes the ultimate unreliable narrator, someone trapped inside his own head, someone who can meld his memory the way he sees fit, who sets himself on a course to kill Teddy. Under his condition, everything can be manipulated.
Look, memory can change the shape of a room, it can change the color of a car. And memories can be distorted. They're just an interpretation, they're not a record.
And with a trip to the tattoo parlor to ink this new information onto his skin, the movie ends. For a million reasons, Memento is fantastic. It plays with storytelling, it breaks the rules in order to capture a very specific feeling that relates to this character, and it makes for an incredibly unique movie that stands apart amongst the crowd. It actually kind of startled the audience at Venice, who needed to take a second to collect themselves before launching into a standing ovation. But the movie received nothing but positive reception, which continued throughout the movie's promotional tour, journeying to the Deauville American Film Festival, the Toronto International Film Festival, and eventually ending its run at Sundance in January. Those who saw Following 2 years earlier had realized that Christopher Nolan was a filmmaker to look out for. And now, almost immediately after, those same people were now saying, "See? I told you." Christopher Nolan had now become an indie darling. He was an incredibly promising and unique filmmaker with a distinct voice that made his movies stand out among his peers. Now it was time for him to take the next big leap. Like anyone working in the arts, Christopher Nolan has a lot of influences. I mean, of course, the inspiration to get into movie making was sparked by Star Wars and how game-changing that movie was on release. But then you had Blade Runner, Alien, a lot of the works of Ridley Scott, in fact. Steven Spielberg has no doubt had an influence, especially with Nolan's turn to blockbusters. But he's also praised the work of Michael Bay, which some might consider taboo, but you can see those kinds of influences in these movies. Michael Bay is all in on chaotic, adrenaline-fueled action scenes. Never in a million years is it about the clarity of the action, more about the visceral feeling of it. Sometimes that works to its enormous benefit, like the car chase in Bad Boys 2, other times it can be a detriment, like some select sequences in the Transformers movies. But those instincts can be seen in many of Nolan's own action scenes. They're about the chaos and feeling of the action above the total clarity, even if that has changed over the years with the advent of shooting in IMAX. Nolan is also quite well read. There's plenty of literature that has inspired him, even directly taking the form of the basis of stories sometimes, like in The Dark Knight Rises, which takes plenty of inspiration from A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. But I think beyond all of that, there's no separating 2001: A Space Odyssey from the list of Nolan's influences. You can see hallmarks from this movie in a lot of Nolan's work, from certain set designs and especially into some of the ships in Interstellar. You can draw a direct line from the Endurance there to some of the ships in 2001, along with ideas like rotating a set to create the illusion of changing gravity, which was a trick Nolan employed on Inception. Nolan's love for 2001 really came through when he oversaw the 70mm restoration of the movie, which allowed it to have an IMAX release in 2018 for its 50th anniversary. Above all else, Christopher Nolan loves movies, and he loves being able to preserve movies and give people the theatrical experience, either through movies he loves, movies he wants to show the crew, and the movies he makes. The experience of seeing it in the theater is what trumps everything else. It was actually a relief for Nolan at this point that his next movie was already getting up and running. Since Memento was such a critical hit, there was going to be a lot of pressure to find a project that could live up to it. But since a project was already nailed down, an American remake of the Norwegian film Insomnia, Nolan could instead put his focus on making something different, on stretching different muscles. And different it was. Insomnia is a bit of an outlier in Nolan's career for a few reasons, but the biggest has to be that this is his only movie where he has no writing credit whatsoever. Of course, the movie is a remake of a Norwegian film, but this version was also written by Hilary Seitz. So, unlike his other movies, this was Nolan stepping into a project and taking it on from what others had built up, rather than him creating the idea or launching the project pretty much from the very beginning. But Nolan did work very closely with Hilary Seitz throughout development and pre-production. He still made an effort to make sure he knew the ins and outs of the story and had a solid grasp of everything he needed to. The other significant change was with the cast. Given that this was a studio feature with far more financial backing, Nolan was able to go for a more star-studded A-list cast of actors to fill these roles. I mean, suddenly he's now working with household names like Al Pacino and Robin Williams. Al Pacino, of course, was known for The Godfather Part 2, Scarface, Heat, all sorts of well-known and well-regarded movies. Robin Williams, however, was going to be playing against type. While everyone knew him for his comedic chops and likability, even within more dramatic movies, now he was going to be playing the main villain. A far more subdued and unsettling kind of character. And to fill out the lead characters, Hilary Swank joined the cast. She, of course, was a rapidly rising star through the 90s and early 2000s, even winning an Oscar for Best Lead Actress in the movie Boys Don't Cry. The rest of the cast began to fill out from there as pre-production traveled into the year 2001. But while Insomnia was getting underway, Memento still needed to get its flowers. Because after the promotional circuit came to a close, Memento finally released in theaters starting on March 16th. And the short story that inspired it, written by Jonathan Nolan, was published with Esquire magazine very shortly after. Now, Memento only opened in 11 theaters to start, which is not a lot. In fact, that's hardly anything. Perhaps it's proof that it couldn't be sold or distributed. But soon enough, New Market Films' gamble would pay off, throwing the egg right in the face of all the distributors who turned the movie down. Once people had the chance to see the movie, word of mouth took over. Eventually, Memento managed to rise to a whopping 500 theaters across the country, and on a budget of $4.5 million, it managed to rake together $40 million worldwide, which was a massive profit. Anyone who saw the movie was paying attention now. Anyone interested in the inner workings of the film industry were certainly hearing about indie darling Christopher Nolan, and eyes were on his next venture to see how he'd fare under the studio system. And at the same time, Christopher Nolan and Emma Thomas created their very own film production company. On February 27th, they established Syncope, based on the word syncopation, which was suggested by Nolan's father, who was a fan of classical music. This wouldn't be a major company, with there being a maximum of 4 employees, but it would allow a little bit more oversight onto the creation of Nolan's future feature films. Insomnia entered production not long after, starting on April 9th, 2001, and running for over 50 days, double the length of Memento's production. Now, while it might sound like they had more time to put the movie together, the opposite was the case. Working under studio oversight gave less time for prep and planning, so scenes were often prepped the very night before shooting. These were still possible working conditions, but there was a different level of pressure. Nolan was now working with a larger crew again, with even more equipment and toys that can be offered with the amount of money they acquired. Though Nolan still maintained some of his professional relationships, with Wally Pfister once again joining as the cinematographer, shooting on 35mm film. And new relationships would spark as well, with Nathan Crowley joining as the movie's production designer, beginning an incredibly long-lasting professional partnership. But for many reasons, this was another big leap for Nolan. Perhaps not as big as the leap from Following to Memento, but still quite substantial. This wasn't an indie film anymore. There were real executives with their money on the line keeping an eye on the production. This was the first time Nolan had worked under some actual genuine oversight, which was a change of pace. But Steven Soderbergh gave Nolan some advice when it came to working with a studio. Many filmmakers fear working with a studio because it can trample on their creativity, so they're often fighting it. But Soderbergh suggested that it was better to not be defensive. That if you were willing to have real conversations with those at the studio, you could better communicate with them, and they could put more trust in you, creating a far stronger working relationship. Insomnia filmed mostly in the province of British Columbia, Canada's very own. And on top of that, brief shots were captured in Alaska, which was where the movie was going to be set. So while most of it is Canadian, Alaska still gets some time to shine in the final movie. With a lot more resources, the crew were able to build bigger sets, augment locations, use smoke effects, all sorts of things that may not have been available on Memento and certainly not Following. It was an enormous leap, but one that Nolan once again took on with grace, as the production moved smoothly along until it finally wrapped in June of 2001. It was all post-production all the way home for the movie as things continued into the new year, 2002.
They brought him in to solve an unspeakable crime.
Detective Dormer, it's such an honor to meet you. I'm Detective Ellie Burr. Welcome to Night Mute.
Can't have an upcoming movie without a trailer. In keeping with many others at the time, the trailer for Insomnia featured the trademark trailer voiceover, featuring cryptic clips of our main characters and teases towards the mystery they were set to solve. All the while beginning to shine a light on how the movie's title, Insomnia, is going to impact our protagonist and twist the story on its head to create a satisfying and interesting thriller. Combined with teases of Robin Williams' villainous performance, this is the epitome of a trailer you catch in the theater and then say, yeah, that looks interesting, let's check that out. Which was of course bolstered by the card used early on that this movie was from the director of Memento. Memento had made its rounds by now, so those paying attention were surely interested to see what Christopher Nolan would cook up next. Now, since this was a studio movie, it didn't quite need to go through the same festival rigmarole that Following and Memento did to find distribution. This was Warner Brothers' movie, and they were going to get it out in front of audiences. But that didn't mean it wasn't going to hit at least one festival, because on May 2nd, Insomnia was shown for the very first time at the Tribeca Film Festival. The very first Tribeca Film Festival, actually. Founded in part by Robert De Niro to help revitalize the culture and economy of Lower Manhattan in the wake of 9/11. But it wasn't long after its appearance at Tribeca that Insomnia would see its wide release. Without headache, without dancing through hoops, Insomnia was going to head to theaters. Those interested in the blossoming career of Christopher Nolan and those interested in the detective noir genre as a whole surely headed to their local theater to catch a glimpse at this new Al Pacino vehicle. Because finally, on May 24th, 2002, Christopher Nolan's third feature film, his first under the studio system, was out in the world to watch for all. Los Angeles detective Will Dormer has been sent up north to the small town of Nightmute, Alaska. Why? He and his partner Hap Eckhart are in town to help the local police solve the murder of a teenage girl. And it starts out fairly standard, it's what you expect. It's a detective story, a noir in a lot of ways, wherein Dormer must collect the facts, interview suspects, cross some off the list, all before locating the real killer. That's at least how things start to shake out, until one part of his plan goes completely awry. During a mission in the fog to find the lead suspect, Will Dormer accidentally kills his partner. The question is, was it an accident? See, the reason they were in Alaska was partly to get out of Dodge. There was an internal affairs investigation going on in Los Angeles, and Dormer was scared they would catch him on something that might send everyone he's ever put in jail back out into the world. Eckhart, however, was ready to talk. He was ready to make a deal, one that would probably leave Dormer completely out of it, not that Dormer ever believed him.
Do you think Warfield gives a flying fuck about you shaking down a couple of drug dealers? You think that's gonna get him his headlines? He needs the big fish. He's putting a squeeze on you to get to me. It's very simple, Hap.
So now that Hap is dead and Dormer's the one that's killed him, was it an accident? Was it on purpose to cover his tracks? Now he's got even more tracks to cover to put the blame of this murder onto the same guy who did the other murder. What ultimately comes of this is that, while we initially suspect that Dormer is a solid detective who's very good at what he does, that assumption very quickly begins to fall apart. Dormer is making questionable decisions left and right. The longer the story goes, the more you see the frayed edges, especially when sleep comes into question. Since Nightmute is so far north and it's just the right time of year, the sun never sets. It's constantly daylight at all hours of the day.
So when does it get dark around here?
It doesn't. Not this time of year.
The kicker is, Dormer is unable to cope. There's just a bit too much light creeping through his window. It's not for the lack of trying. Dormer does many small things to maybe help him doze off, but none of them ever work. In fact, he never sleeps once during the movie. The very first time we meet him, he's waking up. From then on, he goes at least 6 nights straight without sleep. And Al Pacino gradually goes through the different levels of sleep deprivation as the movie goes along. Early on, he's fairly alert, but as the movie continues, he begins to lose focus, lose attention. The movie's even playing with visual tricks to get inside his head. Sudden focus changes, sudden sound effects, heightening certain things as if Dormer himself is losing a bit of his grounding. He's kind of falling apart the longer the movie goes, and you can see it at every step.
How do you like our beer?
Victor Dormer needs is a little shut-eye.
There is a slight side effect to putting this much emphasis on sleep, though, and it brings me no joy to say it since it's probably the most damning criticism against this movie and something the filmmakers were actively trying to avoid. It's also worth noting that it might be me and not the movie. It might be the time of day when I watched it, but I did find myself getting a little sleepy at points. Maybe it was the movie putting that into my head. Maybe it was completely unrelated. I don't know, but that's what happened. Now, Dormer spends a lot of the movie trying to cover his tracks, trying to make sure the murder of Eckhart is pinned on someone other than him. Unfortunately, the killer, Walter Finch, played by Robin Williams, saw everything. He knows the truth. He knows what Dormer did. So if Dormer has any hope of keeping his record intact, especially since the IA investigation might come back to bite him, he has to work with the man he's chasing. And Robin Williams is giving a very solid performance here. It's quite different from what he's usually known for, but this movie stretches a different dramatic muscle, allowing him to play an unsuspecting villain. He plays it mostly straight, but that's what gets you. He's using relative normalcy to give a sense of unease. He's being normal to be unsettling, and it works.
Under pressure, you don't always see the wood for the trees. You, for one, should have figured that one out by now.
Hilary Swank as Ellie Burr might be a standout, though. She might be the best character in this movie. You know, she's the young, idealistic detective, really the only one in the story who's entirely innocent. She, of course, is investigating the death of Eckhart, and while for the most part it seems pretty cut and dry, there are small inconsistencies that keep her digging just a bit deeper, even using some of Dormer's very own advice to put the pieces together that he was trying to hide.
You shouldn't knock misdemeanors.
No, but it's such small stuff. It gets so boring.
It's all about small stuff. You know, small lies, small mistakes. People give themselves away same in misdemeanors as they do in murder cases. It's just human nature.
Without a doubt, this is the most straightforward movie in Nolan's career so far. The story plays out pretty much entirely linearly. There's no messing with the order of scenes, it's all played front to back. The only exceptions are brief flashes of flashback shots, but even those are mostly motivated by the current goings-on in the story, so it's less jumping and more remembering. There are enough twists to keep it interesting, though, enough rug pulls to keep Dormer and the audience on their toes, and the atmosphere and visuals of the movie take it a long way. But this movie is certainly a bit of an odd duck in Nolan's career. It's the one people talk about the least, I think, though those that have talked about it would claim it's underrated or unsung, maybe even slept on. But while this movie might not play with time or memory like Memento and following, it does still feature some threads that are becoming common in Nolan's movies. The main thing is that Nolan seems to be very interested in protagonists who make morally questionable decisions. Between all three of his protagonists, none are squeaky clean, and that's what makes them interesting. Nolan is interested in exploring these characters to understand why they did what they did and get you to follow along as if watching over their shoulder. The big thing for Dormer this time is that the internal affairs investigation against him is not unjustified. In a past case, Dormer was absolutely certain that a man was guilty of torture and murder, but there wasn't enough evidence to back it up, not enough to make it stick. So, Dormer planted evidence. He knew he had the right guy, and this was just the right push to remove all reasonable doubt. But to do so compromised his own morals, and maybe even the case itself.
I could feel it right there. This is gonna catch up with me. I don't do things like that.
That's why Dormer is so spooked by the IA investigation. That's why he was so spooked that Eckhart wanted to make a deal. And maybe, just maybe, he could see Eckhart through the fog and shot him willingly. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it wasn't. Not even Dormer knows for sure. Overall, this isn't a movie that blew me away particularly, but it is a very fascinating stepping stone for Nolan and his career for a few significant reasons. For one thing, it's bigger. Obviously, we're dealing with bigger, more well-known stars, but we're also dealing with a bigger location. There's a lot more money going towards showing off the enormous landscapes of these areas. Glorious wide shots of BC mountains, even Alaska glaciers. It's a long ways away from the dingy motels of Memento or stealing time inside a cafe and following. The other big thing about this movie is that it's really the first time Nolan has dealt with fully staged action scenes. They might not be massive, but they're certainly more involved than the brief tussles you might have seen in his other movies. The log sequence in this movie particularly stands out, as Dormer tries to chase Finch across logs floating on the water. Logs that are moving, rotating, colliding with each other. It's tense and uses the location to do an action scene you might not see anywhere else. A lot of the action here, while brief, is also a bit claustrophobic. The emphasis is less on total clarity and more on the intensity and the chaos. It's not about seeing everything, it's more about feeling it, with just enough visual information so that you can still mostly tell what's happening. Which all leads to the finale. Ellie Burr's investigation has led her to discover the truth about Dormer, that he killed his partner, and the two of them are independently going after Walter Finch, knowing without a shadow of a doubt that he killed that teenage girl. There's a big shootout, even a bit of clever planning as Dormer flanks to get around Finch from behind. It's brief, it's chaotic, but it's quite effective in what it's trying to do, until it ultimately ends with Dormer and Finch both shooting each other. Finch immediately dies as a result, sinking to the bottom of the lake, while Dormer gets a few final moments. Moments where Ellie almost tries to cover up her own discoveries of Dormer until he says,
Don't lose your way.
It's an interesting endpoint, an ending where Ellie has to stick to her own convictions and fight for the truth, no matter who it might hurt, while Dormer finally gets the chance to clear his conscience right before the end. Because the gunshot wound finally takes its toll, and Dormer's lights go out one last time.
Just let me sleep.
Apparently there was an alternate ending shot for this movie where Dormer would have survived, but in order to stay true to the story, Steven Soderbergh encouraged Nolan to stick to his guns and end on this more bittersweet note. And to some amount of surprise, the studio had no objections. It fit the story for Dormer to end this way, to finally get that sleep and have his conscience cleared while his past came right back to the forefront. And it's on that note that Insomnia comes to an end. It's alright. It's solid. I don't think it lingers in the mind the same way Memento would, but it has plenty going for it visually and story-wise. I might not have been blown away, but there's plenty to admire with this more straightforward detective story. Critical reception was also quite positive, with many praising the performances, particularly Robin Williams. This movie also helped him break even further into dramatic roles, stretching different acting muscles as he went on. And the box office came through as well. On a $46 million budget, Insomnia managed to rake in $114 million worldwide. A solid return for a mid-budget movie like this. It made a profit. Nolan's first studio fare had made a profit, which solidified his relationship with Warner Brothers. They were convinced to take a risk on him, and it managed to pay off. This indie darling had officially graduated to the big leagues, with more and more people beginning to learn his name. But it wasn't like Nolan was going to spend too much time stopping to smell the roses. The next project began to get going rather quickly. In fact, Nolan actually had a couple projects that he was interested in pursuing. One of which was a biopic on film producer, billionaire, aerospace engineer Howard Hughes. In a lot of ways, it was bound to be the culmination of everything Nolan had done up to that point. He had even called it the best script he'd ever written. Things were starting to get moving, with Jim Carrey attached to star as the titular character. But the entire process of the movie would stop right in its tracks when Nolan learned that Martin Scorsese was making his very own Howard Hughes movie. Starring Leonardo DiCaprio and produced by Michael Mann, this would become The Aviator. Of course, when Martin Scorsese says he's gonna do something, you kinda just stand to the side and let him do his thing. It was no doubt disappointing, but such is the way of things sometimes. There was another project Nolan was interested in, however. While Memento was making the rounds, producer Valerie Dean handed Nolan a copy of the book The Prestige, written by Christopher Priest. A story of two magicians who wind up in a defining and self-destructive rivalry to create the greatest trick possible. But while the novel was deeply interesting, Nolan was getting Insomnia off the ground at that point, so he didn't quite have the time to go full tilt into adapting it just yet. So he handed the book to his brother Jonathan, trusting him and him alone to find the screenplay within. Jonathan Nolan, of course, hadn't written a screenplay before, so it was a pretty big leap. But Christopher Nolan had faith in him and sent him on his merry way. Of course, it would still take a considerable amount of time to get The Prestige off the ground, to get the screenplay to anywhere near functional. So while Jonathan was working on that script, Nolan himself was sort of looking around a little bit for the next project that he could tackle in the interim. Perhaps another movie that could fill the gap while The Prestige was in the slow cooker, essentially. But what that project would be, he never could have predicted. For about 6 years at this point, Warner Brothers had been spinning their wheels trying to get one of their premier franchises back in movie theaters. This franchise, this character, of course, being Batman. With different writers, different pitches coming in and out, they consistently tried to get something off the ground, but they never managed to land on something. Maybe Batman will fight Superman. Maybe they'll do Batman Beyond. Maybe they'll do Batman Year One. But nothing ever stuck. Meanwhile, Marvel was absolutely killing it on the big screen with Blade, X-Men, Spider-Man. There was definitely an appetite for superhero movies, and Warner Brothers knew that Batman would also hit if they could get him back out there. Eventually, word of this unknown Batman project managed to reach Emma Thomas, who was asked whether Christopher Nolan would be at all interested in taking it on. Emma Thomas actually didn't think he would be. She didn't think Nolan would want to tackle that kind of project. But when she approached him with it, she discovered that he was in fact very interested. He was excited about it. Christopher Nolan had been a fan of Batman since he was a kid, like a lot of people. He had seen the other movies, he had read some comics, there's even a Batman logo on the door to Jeremy Theobald's house and following. Christopher Nolan had dreamed for a long time of getting to make a blockbuster movie. It's the dream of any up-and-coming filmmaker, especially one of his age, being brought up as some of the biggest, most influential movies of all time are coming out at record pace. So now he could use a lot of those influences to make the blockbuster movie he had always wanted to make. Taking inspiration from Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Superman. It's also where he decided to base the sense of humor. There was a specific tone to a lot of those movies that Nolan really enjoyed and wanted to bring to this.
I sat in a room with Jeff Robinoff and Greg Silverman. There were a lot of conversations about humor, how much humor is going to be in there. And I'd say, well, if you watch Raiders of the Lost Ark or something, there's a couple of great gags in there, but it's not a comedic film. They got that.
But what made this particular proposal the most interesting is that Warner Brothers was essentially asking, what do we do with Batman? And they didn't have an answer. It wasn't a rhetorical question. They were looking for someone that could answer that question, which gave Nolan himself an insane amount of freedom to make the Batman movie he wanted to. Nolan very quickly landed on the idea of doing an origin story, something that hadn't been done in any of the other movies. To ask the question, well, why did Bruce Wayne become Batman? How did that occur? While at the same time, he wanted to set it in a near-realistic world. Obviously not 100% real, there would certainly be some heightened elements, but a world close enough to our own where you could believe these things were really happening. But Nolan was no comic book expert. He had read some as a kid, but there was so much he didn't know. So he decided to bring in David S. Goyer as a writer on the project. He had an immense knowledge of comics, he even had writing credits on the Blade movies to back himself up. And the two of them, together with production designer Nathan Crowley, worked right in Nolan's garage in Los Angeles to design, sculpt, and piece together everything they needed for this movie. To come up with the most solid pitch to Warner Brothers of what the movie was going to be, how it would feel, how it would look, the whole 9 yards. In a strange sense, David S. Goyer would remark that it kind of felt like an independent movie, despite it being the beginnings of a tentpole blockbuster. That's what made the Nolan approach unique. But there was definitely a level of uncertainty in this whole idea, because what Nolan was pitching was a completely new take on Batman that was entirely divorced from what the previous movies had done, and that was almost unheard of at the time. People weren't using the word reboot in regards to movies yet. Sure, it's something your computer can do, and it was a TV show in the 90s, but it wasn't a concept people really considered in movies. To start over, to ignore previous entries, and go in as if nothing had ever happened, it was a big leap, but one that was absolutely necessary in reinventing this character for the modern day. But there was no denying that this was another enormous leap for Nolan, and that shone through on the casting. The breadth of this story would allow Nolan to work with a much wider pool of actors, dipping even further into A-list territory. Obviously, the most consequential choice was, who was going to play Batman? Many people auditioned for the role, many people were considered, including Jake Gyllenhaal, Henry Cavill, Ewan Bailey, and even Guy Pearce, who of course starred in Memento. Nolan was interested in continuing their partnership after that movie, but studio heads at Warner Brothers never actually got Guy Pearce for one reason or another, so it never came to be. Instead, the role went to Christian Bale, who was actually the first actor Nolan spoke to about the movie. Now, after having looked at every other actor in town, he circled back to Christian Bale to offer him the role. There really wasn't anyone else he thought could take it on. From there, the cast began to expand exponentially, with tons of world-famous actors joining the project. We got Morgan Freeman, Gary Oldman, Liam Neeson, Rutger Hauer, Katie Holmes, and then 2 actors who would begin a decades-long collaborative partnership with Nolan. First, you had Michael Caine, of course a legendary actor having appeared in movies of all types for decades. As the story goes, Nolan went directly to Michael Caine, approaching him at his house for the role of Alfred. Michael Caine was quite apprehensive at first. I mean, playing Batman's butler? Not to mention the fact that the script would have to leave with Nolan. So he needed an answer quickly, waiting in the house as Michael Caine read through it. And it was only after that, along with a brief conversation about how much more breadth this character would have compared to previous iterations, that Michael Caine decided to sign on. And the other player was Cillian Murphy, who was one of many people who auditioned and even screen tested for the role of Batman and Bruce Wayne. While all parties involved agreed that he wasn't right for that part, both Nolan and the studio really loved his screen test, and that gave Nolan enough confidence to convince the studio to keep Murphy around. Now he was going to play the Scarecrow. It was the beginning of 2 very long-lasting friendships, and 2 of the longest-lasting director-cast relationships in Nolan's entire career. It's been said many times that the key to being a good director is to really be good at casting, at finding the right actors for each part, finding the right people who will be able to work together, and then letting them work. Some believe that 90% of the director's job happens during the casting process, and the rest of it in some ways falls into place after that. By all accounts, Nolan seems to be very good at casting, and he seems to be able to attract some of the best actors in the business on repeat. Some of the world's most famous, greatest performers, all gathering together to be part of whatever he's got cooking up next. All accounts seem to suggest a very friendly working environment on Nolan's sets. They're very welcoming in a lot of ways. They're certainly working fast and certainly on the move a lot of the time, but all accounts say that it's really conducive to productivity. And Nolan himself has gone on record to say that one of the things he really tries not to do is lie to the actors, because they can tell.
What you find with great actors, and I work with some really great actors, is they are human lie detectors, and they are students of human behavior, and you cannot, you sit there with Al Pacino, you cannot lie to him. He will see it absolutely immediately. So you have to be completely honest with these people, and you have to include them in your creative process.
And when it comes to the number of takes, Nolan will do the amount of takes the actor requires. He's a very actor's director in that way. Doing an extra take doesn't add that much time overall, at least compared to the amount of time it takes to set everything up. So if an actor says they have a little something more to offer, a little something more they want to do, Nolan will spin up the camera again and give them the opportunity to do that. But what I think is even more interesting than that is apparently he's not one to give a lot of notes. The things he says to the actors are usually very brief one-sentence directions that just send them on a path. Cillian Murphy talked about a scene in Oppenheimer where he was maybe playing it a bit too tough, a bit too strong, and Nolan said to him, referring to the character, "He's not a boxer, he's a chess player." And that just hit right into what Cillian Murphy was doing and had him dialed in for the next take. A similar story was famously told by Gary Oldman regarding the Batman movies, where Nolan took him aside to simply say, "There's more at stake." And that was all Gary Oldman needed to turn up the dial just a little bit on the next take and get what Nolan was after. Many actors who have worked with Nolan have had nothing but positive things to say about the experience, with others wishing to visit his sets just to watch him work. Although that particular example comes from Ben Affleck, so he might just be going there for Matt Damon. For a specific example, after working on Dunkirk, Kenneth Branagh had this to say about the atmosphere many directors like Nolan create on set and how the chaos of making a movie is controlled. They create harmony on set. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't passion and temper involved, but they create an atmosphere in which it is possible to both seriously approach your work and also have fun. Chris Nolan helped to create a center to that storm, and I think I've learned from that perspective, the way in which you can create and apply and benefit from concentration in the midst of chaos. With the cast and crew assembled, everything eventually led to March of 2004, where finally, after years of trial and error, principal photography got kicked off. This movie was going to work under the biggest budget of Nolan's career so far, and it wasn't particularly close. Each movie had been an immense graduation and escalation from where he was at previously. $6,000 for Following, $4.5 million for Memento, $46 million for Insomnia, and now $150 million for the movie that was now known as Batman Begins. When it came to this movie, it was very significant for the creative team, Nolan especially, that they could go much farther than any of his previous movies. They could journey around the world to see things and shoot things they weren't able to before. There was an express stance that Nolan, Wally Pfister, and the entire team did not want it to feel like the movie was shot exclusively within sound stages, that there was a broader look that encompassed the world. Which is why they took great pride in beginning production in Iceland, far from the city of Gotham, to capture some of the movie's earlier sequences. From there, filming took place across the United Kingdom, at Mentmore Towers, and specifically at the Cardington Hangar, where an enormous set was built for the streets of Gotham. They essentially put together an entire city block. And finally, exteriors and a massive chase scene were filmed in Chicago. Nolan very deliberately had an aversion to digital effects. When working at this scale, there's certainly a lot of pressure to start utilizing the latest and greatest technology. And more movies were transitioning to digital thanks in large part to the efforts of George Lucas and the Star Wars prequel trilogy. But on this movie, wherever humanly possible, Nolan wanted to film as much stuff in camera as he could. Real stunt work, real explosions, real effects, real sets, real locations, and even a real Batmobile. This time dubbed the Tumbler. Based on model work done during pre-production, the team created a full-size tumbler that could rush around at speeds up to or even exceeding 100 miles an hour. It was insanely useful for one of the movie's most pivotal action sequences. This was the kind of stuff that got the most attention from the outside world, as images of the tumbler quickly made their way online. This was perhaps one of the biggest departures for Nolan and company on this movie. Unlike his previous movies, this is one that fans and eagle-eyed audiences were actively paying attention to. It became a bit of a shift from, oh, we're trying our damnedest to get eyes on this movie, to, oh, we need to keep this movie under wraps because we don't want too many people getting eyes on this movie. This was even the first time one of Nolan's movies was shot under a working title to try and stave off onlookers. Instead of being known as Batman Begins, the movie was working under the title The Intimidation Game, which even became the center of rumors during pre-production. Is that what the movie was going to be called? But even with all of that pressure, there was still a calmness to the whole affair. Nolan never seemed to let the pressure get to him. There were plenty of accounts of people surprised at how easygoing and smooth it was moving, even with the enormous price tag. Wally Pfister would even say that once they got down to actually shooting a take, it was no different than Memento or Insomnia. From start to finish, this was always Nolan's movie. But of course, it was still much bigger than anything he had done, and the marketing was going to make that apparent. This was Batman, one of the most popular characters in all of fiction, getting a new movie. So Warner Brothers worked hard to get the word out as soon as possible, which all began right at the tail end of July 2004. Nearly a year before the release of the movie, the very first teaser trailer was released in theaters. Of course, since this was released during production, there wasn't a ton of footage to go off of, but audiences were able to catch glimpses of sweeping mountain ranges, narration from Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne, all building into the reveal of Batman himself. The trailer was even structured in such a way where, if you saw it in a theater, you wouldn't know it was Batman until the very end, which got many people really excited. Promotional efforts only skyrocketed once production came to a close in September of 2004. Promotion for the summer movie season of 2005 was starting to get underway, and Batman was one of the biggest tentpole hitters. The second, still 60-second long teaser released on December 3rd, 2004, followed by a teaser poster. This one opened up even further into the origin of this version of Bruce Wayne, his training, his ascent to vigilantism, with even a quick, flashy montage of action to bring the trailer to a close. It was quick, it was fast, there were many moments that were blink and you miss it, but it managed to convey plenty about the movie's tone and visual style.
Where are you?
Marketing only continued from there into the year 2005. For the first time in Nolan's career, this movie made an appearance at the Super Bowl, with a brief 30-second spot showcasing more of Bruce Wayne's journey and the creation of this iconic character, even featuring some glimpses at the movie's sense of humor.
So what do you think? Does it come in black?
And eventually, the last leg of promotion kicked off in March of 2005 with the full trailer, which was actually released during an episode of Smallville on the WB. And this trailer was by far the biggest step for promotion on this movie. It showed the scope, it showed the action, the effects, and even some of the philosophy behind Bruce Wayne's choice to become the Caped Crusader.
If you make yourself more than just a man, then you become something else entirely. Which is a legend, Mr. Wayne.
With promotional efforts, posters, trailers, TV spots, the whole 9 yards getting out to audiences in anticipation of this movie's release, this really is the first time in Nolan's career where you can define the lead up to a movie as exciting. Following and Memento more or less appeared at the respective film festivals, with word of mouth really carrying Memento along, and Insomnia was an interesting crime drama that played to the audience it was aimed for. But the more wide-reaching, more traditional hype was first felt right here. Batman fans, comic book fans, they were all excited and interested in what Christopher Nolan had cooked up. And some of that can be attributed to Nickelback, let's not forget. And to think this meteoric rise came about in less than a decade. It was only 7 years before Nolan had finished Following, and only 5 years since he had made Memento. He had gone from an indie darling to the steward of one of the most popular characters of all time in less than a decade. Honestly, the dream trajectory for any director. And this time it was going to be seen on more screens than any Nolan movie before it. And it was even going to spend some time on the biggest screens around. Batman Begins would find itself on IMAX screens for a portion of its run. If you wanted to see Batman fight crime on a whopping 50-foot tall screen, now was your chance. The question was it gonna work? Was this radical approach to Batman, completely starting over, going to pay off? There was plenty of confidence on the studio's end. They had complete and total faith in what Nolan had made and were by his side at every step of the way, but there was still the question of, what if it doesn't play to audiences? There was a lot of faith, but also a lot of stress, a lot of unknown factors. All it really meant was that people just had to go out and see the movie for themselves. The world premiere of Batman Begins was held on May 31st in Tokyo, Japan. Really the first time there was a full-blown world premiere for one of Nolan's movies that didn't involve a festival of some kind, which led to the wide release 2 short weeks later. Finally, after 8 years since Batman was last on the big screen and only 7 since Nolan finished his first feature film, it was time to journey to theaters for his blockbuster debut. The clock had turned to June 15th, 2005. So pop into your Batmobile and get over to Gotham City because it's time to see the beginning of Batman. Psychology is at the heart of a lot of Nolan's movies. I mentioned earlier that he seems to like following protagonists who make morally questionable decisions and getting to the bottom of why they would make said decisions. But that also extends to protagonists who make extraordinary decisions. They might not be morally questionable, but they are quite extreme. And what is a more extraordinary choice than Bruce Wayne deciding to become Batman? A man orphaned at a young age, his parents killed in front of him, he went on a journey around the world after he couldn't get his revenge. After getting trained by Henry Ducard in the League of Shadows, he finally returns to Gotham to strike fear in the hearts of criminals across the city to help bring it out of its depression.
People need
dramatic examples to shake them out of apathy, and I can't do that as Bruce Wayne.
What this gives us is a methodical origin story where every element is given care and attention. Every piece of equipment is given a reason for being, every piece of information is important, and everything is constructed from start to finish. Why did Bruce Wayne choose to do this? Because of his innate sense of justice, that the world is broken and that there's a way to fix it. Why did he choose to do it in this way? Because the system is broken in favor of those who are breaking it. All the while pushing through with themes of fear, how it controls us, and how Bruce uses it against his enemies.
My bets lost away.
That's frightened me. This time my enemies shared my dread.
But while psychology is at the center of this movie, it's also aimed squarely at being a 4-quadrant blockbuster. A movie that can appeal to anyone of any age, of any demographic. Anyone can sit down and enjoy this movie. That's the entire idea. What this really gives us is the first instance of Nolan as a populist entertainer. He's not just making movies for a specific audience or for those who are keen enough to be on the lookout for it. This is a movie for everyone, but still with that keen Nolan sensibility underneath it all. The main thing that propels the movie forward, however, is the fact that it's cool. So much of this movie is designed around being cool. Every gadget, every development, especially when it comes to how Bruce Wayne slowly puts together every piece of his Batman persona, it's all really cool.
So what do you think? Does it come in black?
I honestly don't think there's any reaction you can have coming out of this movie aside from, Batman is really cool. He uses fear against his enemies, he uses theatricality and deception to get the once-over on them, just as he was trained by Ducard, and it all builds into the grand reveal an hour into the movie.
What the hell are you?
I'm Batman.
The standout moment for me, though, has to be the creation of the bat signal. One of the core pieces of Batman iconography is the floodlight pointed at the clouds, complete with Batman's insignia to call him into action. And here, after an hour of movie where Carmine Falcone has been built up as the worst of the worst in Gotham, Batman finally has him strung up on a floodlight, his clothes torn, his arms outspread, creating the iconic image in the sky. While it isn't used just yet to call Batman into action, it is the signal to everyone in Gotham that he exists now. The Batman is here, and he's here to get things done. In a lot of ways, this movie is a quantum leap for Nolan's career. It isn't a startling one from his perspective, it wasn't his first time working with the studio, so he knew how to play ball. But in many other areas, this movie was a major leap forward. We got a bigger cast, with more actors than you can shake a stick at, both in major and minor roles. Bigger production value, with larger sets, bigger locations. You thought the glaciers of Insomnia were crazy? We got even more glaciers this time. One of the most notable changes, though, is with the music. For the first time, Nolan worked with composer Hans Zimmer, who also teamed up with James Newton Howard on this movie. Together, they created a far more pulse-pounding score than what we've heard before. It's far more percussive, it's heavier, it's darker, it's propulsive, it powers virtually every moment. It also comes with plenty of thematic motifs, some for Bruce's parents, some for the action of Batman, some for Rachel Dawes. Everything gets a slightly different sound. But the thing that surprised me the most when watching these movies is that one of the most defining differences here is with the editing. Now, it might just be due to the fact that this is the first all-out action blockbuster of Nolan's career, but it does move faster. And I think it has to do with the fact that Nolan's working with a different editor this time. Following was edited by Nolan himself alongside Gareth Heel, while Dodie Dorn edited both Memento and Insomnia. But this time, Lee Smith takes on the editing, and almost immediately you can feel the difference in pace. The movie is building up a lot more momentum. It's carrying itself from one sequence to the next with greater speed. It establishes a pace pretty early on and manages to maintain it pretty much the entire time. This is the longest of Nolan's movies so far, but it doesn't feel like it. It's dense, but it's not bloated. It's methodical, but it isn't slow. Not to mention there are more examples of cross-cut montages, where different scenes are combined together to really build that sense of momentum. One of the key sequences being a training montage early on.
You have learned to bury your guilt with anger. I will teach you to confront it and to face the truth. You know how to fight 6 men. We can teach you how to engage 600.
Which leads to the other quantum leap, the action. The action in this movie is dialed to 11 when compared to Insomnia, yet it still often feels a little claustrophobic, especially during the hand-to-hand sequences. Most of the focus is once again built on giving the feeling of the action rather than simply giving the clarity of the action, which can be hit or miss for some. But it is brought through to stellar effect during Batman's introduction, using the chaos to mask his appearance, only giving glimpses of him as the criminals grow more fearful the closer he gets. Comparisons can easily be made to Jaws or even Alien for how they mostly mask the shark or alien's appearance to keep you fearful for as long as possible, which allows you to feel the fear the criminals do, and gives a certain thrill when Batman takes them down. Again, it's very cool. But sometimes the action gets a bit bigger than that. Sometimes you get the movie's breakout sequence, the tumbler chase. This scene is absolutely enormous, seeing the tumbler barrel through Gotham City streets, crushing cop cars, causing property damage left and right. There are tricks, there are reversals, and the whole thing is moving at 100 miles an hour. Not to mention the sound is also fantastic. I mean, the growl and roar of the tumbler's engine, combined with the skidding of the tires, that's good stuff right there. Cap it all off with a spectacular effect shot of the tumbler crashing through a waterfall, and you have yourself an incredibly exciting action set piece. Definitely a highlight of the movie. But even with these advancements or differences, there are some Nolan hallmarks that still make it through, most notably with some returning faces. Mark Boone Jr. is back after having been in Memento. Larry Holden is also back. This is his third outing with Nolan, having starred in both Memento and Insomnia. But it goes further back, with both Lucy Russell and Jeremy Theobald making cameo appearances. And there's a brief appearance by John Nolan, Christopher Nolan's uncle, as one of the members of the Wayne Enterprises board. It was quite fun for me actually spotting some of these people in this movie. I've seen this movie many times, but watching it all within this context, it's like, hey, I remember him. That's fun. It's nice to see that even when dealing with the biggest budget he'd ever worked with so far, Nolan still brought people back to join him on this adventure. He's come a long way from shooting 15 minutes of footage every Saturday, I'll tell you that. One of the great joys of the movie, though, is that I think the story is pretty airtight. There might be some fantastical elements like the microwave emitter, and there are certainly holes you can poke into there, but when it comes to the character stories, those are batting 1,000 at every turn. There are setups and payoffs all over the movie. Some of them are quite big.
And why do we fall, Bruce? So we can learn to pick ourselves up.
Why do we fall, sir? So that we can learn to pick ourselves up.
And others might be smaller.
It's a nice coat. Nice coat. Thanks.
Character relationships grow and evolve as the movie continues, one of the best being between Batman and Gordon. Alfred and Lucius Fox get to play a lot more of the comedic beats, making this in a lot of ways Nolan's funniest movie yet. It's very dry, there's a lot of wit, but there are some good laughs all around.
Those shares are worth quite a bit of money.
Well, it's a good thing I left everything to you then.
Quite so, sir. And you can borrow the rolls if you like. Just bring it back with a full tank.
Cillian Murphy as Scarecrow is a standout performance as well, really playing up the psychopathic nature of this character. He's really cold, he's really quite distant, and it's very captivating. There's even a final act twist, where Henry Ducard returns towards the end of the movie only to reveal himself as the true villain Ra's al Ghul, propelling everything into the final stand. It's the biggest, most popcorn movie-like finale yet, featuring enormous effects, grand sets, explosions, and plenty of momentum. I mean, Batman getting dragged around by the train? Come on, dude. The whole thing is fast, it's cross-cutting between two sequences, even giving Gordon a great role to play to help Batman ultimately win the day. And it brings the final payoffs all around for one last kicker.
Always mind your surroundings.
You never did learn to mind your surroundings. You never learned to mind your surroundings.
It's a satisfying, invigorating end to the story that pulls the best tricks in the book together for the grand slam. Being the movie of widest appeal, there's plenty to like with Batman Begins. It might not have the same conceptual flavor of something like Memento, but it still has a unique feel that you really only get with Nolan. I mean, the first act of the movie is told out of order, alternating between Bruce's childhood and upbringing and his training with the League of Shadows. And really, it accomplishes the goal of bringing Batman back to the big screen with aplomb. It was a fresh, new, revitalizing take on the character that audiences hadn't seen before, which meant after the thrills were over, audiences could only get excited about the tease for more.
Waves a calling card.
I'll look into it.
And that right there is Batman Begins. This movie hit with a slam. It really was a slam dunk. Audiences and critics were absolutely blown away. Fans could not be more excited or more energized by the movie. Batman was brought back to the big screen with a unique, incredibly cool take on the character, one that took the world seriously and genuinely shocked the industry into following suit for several years afterward. The box office, on the other hand, was just kind of okay. On a $150 million budget, Batman Begins went home with $205 million domestically and $373 million worldwide. It broke even for sure, but it didn't do as well as some were hoping. The studio was incredibly proud of the movie. They had every bit of faith in Christopher Nolan to pull it off, and that faith was well rewarded. But it didn't run away with all the cash in the world, which left the prospects for a sequel a little unknown. It wasn't a guarantee. But the positive reception and continuing word of mouth, especially once the DVD came around, kept things propelled above sea level. This was the biggest reach Nolan had ever achieved so far in his career, and the reception even came with something that every director would live for. People wanted him back. Fans and audiences wanted him to come back to this franchise to continue the story, to tackle the Joker, to take Batman to the next step. They wanted a second Christopher Nolan Batman movie. But Nolan himself had no real expectation of making a sequel. He of course wasn't naive, he knew that it was a possibility, but he made efforts to not think about it too much. Any idea to set up a sequel or leave something hanging for the next movie wound up being kiboshed in favor of making this movie as good as it could possibly be. Don't leave plot beats off for next time, see if they can work now. By the same token, Nolan wanted to make sure that every project of his was distinct, that each one was different in some way, that he was challenging himself in new ways. Maybe making a sequel would be too close to retreading old ground and it wouldn't live up. But given how positive the reception to Batman Begins was, there was certainly an appetite for more. Maybe all Nolan needed was a bit of time, just a little while to work on another project and let the Batman question stew for a while. Perhaps it was time for Nolan to begin his magic act. It had been 5 years since Nolan passed the novel The Prestige to his brother to develop a screenplay, and it had been in the slow cooker ever since. Though there was nearly a time where The Prestige was going to be made before Batman Begins. They nearly had the cast worked out, they nearly had things put together in time for production, but the script wasn't quite ready yet, so they held off. Instead, Batman got underway, and The Prestige was left to cook just a little while longer. But now, hot on the heels of Batman, Nolan was ready to jump into this project once again, working directly with his brother Jonathan to perfect the script and get it to a place they were both happy with. The distribution deal was made quite a while before this, with New Market Films still backing the project like they did with Memento, alongside Warner Brothers and Disney. although Disney was distributing it under their Touchstone Pictures banner, a label designed for more adult-oriented dramas, even R-rated movies. That way they could have their hand in that pie while still maintaining Disney as the family-friendly brand. And casting took off pretty quickly, with Nolan explicitly not looking for actors who were known for period pieces. He wanted a more contemporary look. Since the script had made the rounds for a couple years, there were plenty of actors who expressed interest in being part of the project. For a brief moment, Josh Hartnett was considered for one of the 2 lead roles. He was even one of the many actors considered for Batman, but he turned that one down, and unfortunately wound up not getting this part either. Instead, the 2 lead roles would be taken on by Hugh Jackman and Christian Bale. Hugh Jackman, of course, had broken into the scene with his incredible performance as Wolverine in the X-Men movies, and he was the first actor to sign on to this project. Christian Bale initially wasn't actually in the running for this movie, but he liked the script and decided to pass it on to Nolan that he wanted to be a part of it. And after giving it some thought, Nolan knew there was really no one else who could take it on. It gave the 2 leads a stark difference that helped sell what made them unique. Hugh Jackman was going to play the showman, while Christian Bale was going to play the technician to a certain extent. Then you had Michael Caine joining for his second Christopher Nolan movie. This began to cement his status as Nolan's lucky charm. The 2 enjoyed working together on Batman, and the partnership would only continue to flourish here. Now, once you have those 3 actors on board, plenty of others stepped up to the plate with interest in joining the project, which is in large part how the rest of the cast managed to come together. Rebecca Hall, Piper Perabo, Scarlett Johansson, and eventually David Bowie as Nikola Tesla. Tesla had a role in the book and was set to have an equally important, if not mysterious, role in the movie. And since Tesla himself was an extraordinary figure for his time, Nolan believed that only David Bowie could take that on. Of course, this was based on his long-lasting music career, but also his acting career, with Nolan especially enjoying his performance in The Man Who Fell to Earth from 1976. Now, it took some convincing to get David Bowie on board. He even declined initially, but Nolan stressed that he was the only one he pictured for the job, and that was just enough to get David Bowie to sign on, to capture the otherworldly qualities of Nikola Tesla. With the cast worked out, production would finally commence on January 16, 2006. In a change of pace, this movie would not have a bigger budget than Nolan's last. Instead, it'd go back down to a modest $40 million. Still a lot of money. Yet still, it'd feature all of the best tricks at Nolan's disposal. Once again, filming on 35mm film with cinematographer Wally Pfister. Production took place across Los Angeles, which the crew admitted was a weird choice considering the movie was set in Victorian-era London. But there were a number of old theaters that could fit the time period, and they were able to make use of the Universal backlot, dressing it to look like a late 19th century city street. The fact that this was a period movie was actually quite significant. I mean, it was the first time Nolan had made a period piece. It wasn't explicitly based on a true story, but it was set during a real time period and around real developments. But in true Nolan fashion, he didn't actually want the movie to feel like it was a period piece. He didn't want the audience watching from a distance, so to speak. Contrary to most period movies, this one was shot primarily handheld, letting the audience stand side by side with the characters. The lighting choices, costume choices, casting choices, everything was meant to be completely contemporary. The goal was to get you to really forget that this was a period movie. Of course, no one's gonna break out a flip phone, but the movie was designed so that it felt like it was happening right now. That way you can live with the characters and be right there with them as they make their way through the story. It even utilized elements of the Victorian era that most period films set at this time often didn't. The Victorian era was a time of great discovery, a great expansion in many ways. Electricity, film cameras, the Industrial Revolution, and the filmmakers wanted to show that off. The speedy production kept up for 3 months across the start of 2006, as it all came to a close on April 9th. One of the biggest surprises is that while Nolan believed he was going back to a smaller scale movie, and while the budget certainly reflected that, the production was still as big as you can get, and the scale of the movie was bound to reflect that, definitely looking as if it cost way more than it actually did. But while the post-production efforts on The Prestige were certainly taking up a lot of Nolan's time and energy, he was still looking ahead to what he would do next. because despite wanting to take this movie to break away from Batman for a while, it really didn't take that long for ideas surrounding Gotham to take root in Nolan's mind. It wasn't long before he started to get really excited about where the story could go. The potential, the prospects, the ways the story could expand, the ways this character could continue to journey forward, it quickly took over. So, despite initial hesitation, it eventually became clear that Christopher Nolan was going to make a second Batman movie. David S. Goyer was once again brought on board, though this time he only had enough availability to write a treatment for the second movie. So Jonathan Nolan would pick it up from there, alongside Christopher Nolan, to write the screenplay based on where Goyer had left off. And like Batman Begins before it, and unlike any of Nolan's other movies, questions and theories raged across the internet. The interest in this movie was unlike anything Nolan had done before, with the biggest question by far being, who was going to play the Joker? This was of course the major tease at the end of Batman Begins, so how were they going to follow it up? Who was going to take it on? Many actors expressed interest in taking on the role, and while most were just rumors, the name still flew across the internet. Crispin Glover, Adrian Brody, Robin Williams even expressed interest. But it wasn't going to be any of them. In fact, the reveal wound up being a total shock to the system, because as Comic-Con was underway in San Diego, the news broke that Heath Ledger was going to take on the character. And in response, fans and audiences collectively said, "What? Have you lost your mind? Heath Ledger? The guy from Brokeback Mountain? An Oscar-winning movie?" There were plenty of people scratching their heads about this, but internally, Nolan was quite confident in the choice. In fact, Heath Ledger was kind of the one to approach Nolan about if there was any place for him in the sequel. He was one of many actors up for Batman the first time around, but he didn't necessarily want to take on that kind of movie. But after seeing Batman Begins, he understood what Nolan was after and wondered if maybe there was a chance for a collaboration on the sequel. And after discussing the character with Nolan, the two realized they were on the exact same page, which is really all you could ever want. So while there was plenty of skepticism on the outside, there was a lot of confidence on the inside. And it was only a few days later that the movie was finally officially announced. On August 1st, 2006, Warner Brothers announced the sequel to Batman Begins. In July 2008, audiences would finally get to see the next theatrical Batman adventure, The Dark Knight. One thing that makes Christopher Nolan quite unique as a director is that he works very closely with the marketing teams on his movies. Many directors might leave that up to people more skilled than them, and certainly Nolan leaves a lot of the hands-on work to the marketing team. He's even gone on record saying how amazed he is at some of the work they've done for his movies. The work of cutting a trailer requires so much split-second changes, so many of the tiniest little single-frame adjustments to give a trailer a whole new feel that makes it come alive. But what the marketing for Nolan's movies really managed to do is ride a very intricate tightrope. On one side, Nolan does not want to reveal too much about his movies before people see them. The idea is to keep the surprises of the movie intact for when people are in the theater. He even specifically told audiences not to read The Prestige before seeing the movie, wanting the twists to play out naturally in the movie. Only after that would you then read the book and get to experience even more. On the other side, however, is that the marketing for a lot of his movies, at least starting with Batman, is designed to make them into events. These aren't just another summer blockbuster. These are the kinds of movies you can be talking about for a year before they come out. They're the kinds of movies everyone is talking about. So you see more intricate and ambitious marketing campaigns that can start over a year before release. They themselves are walking the tightrope of keeping people excited while not overstaying their welcome and getting people annoyed before the movie comes out. Trailers and marketing campaigns are central to Nolan's movies, and it's interesting to see how he is central in making sure they function the way he intends. And once all is said and done, the results speak for themselves.
Shoot me. Come on.
No, I can't
Do it!
How'd you like that?
How do you do it?
Magic.
With only a few short months to go before the release of The Prestige, marketing efforts finally took off. This trailer is very interesting for a number of reasons, the main one of which being that it keeps many of the movie's details concealed, but still manages to reveal enough about the premise to keep you intrigued. The two main characters are in a rivalry, trying to uncover the other's greatest trick. What is the trick? We still don't know, but we know it will turn them against each other, featuring tons of drama, tension, and even the reveal of the basic conceit of the 3 acts of a magician's trick. It manages to say just enough while saying very little. It might not have the worldwide reach of something like Batman, but there's plenty of interesting things to go around as the trailer teases with crumbs what the movie's going to be about.
No more secrets.
Secrets are my life.
It's worth noting, though, that expectations for this movie, at least in terms of box office, were quite dismal. There wasn't a lot of confidence that this movie could appeal to audiences. I mean, sure, the trailer can say that this movie is from the director of Batman Begins and Memento, but it's also a period drama about magicians? Who's gonna go see that? Tracking before the movie came out seemed to suggest that this could be Nolan's first flop. Not to mention, there were even comparisons drawn to another movie releasing that year, The Illusionist, starring Edward Norton. Another example of 2 movies with similar ideas being released around the same time. But that didn't stop the machine from barreling towards the finish line. The movie was fully completed on September 22nd, 2006, just a few weeks before its scheduled release. The release was even pushed up a week from October 27th to October 20th. And finally, it had its world premiere at the El Capitan Theater in Hollywood on October 17th. After half a decade in development, after nearly making it before Batman, it was now time for Christopher Nolan's magician drama to hit theaters. Despite expectations being down the drain in many ways, the movie still managed to rocket its way to theaters to get in front of an audience. The clock had finally turned to October 20th, 2006. So get yourself ready, because it's time to have your mind blown by Christopher Nolan's magic trick. One of the fun things about this movie is that it reveals pretty much everything in the first 2 minutes. We see Cutter, played by Michael Caine, showing off a trick involving a disappearing bird. We see a large field of top hats in the grass. We see Robert Angier performing his great trick. And the narration lets us in on the 3 acts of a magician's trick. The pledge, showing something ordinary, the turn, making it extraordinary, and the prestige, the final payoff.
But you wouldn't clap yet, because making something disappear isn't enough. You have to bring it back.
And yet, despite the fact that the movie is quite plainly laying its cards on the table, it doesn't feel like it's giving the game away, because in that very same narration, Cutter says,
"Now, you're looking for the secret, but you won't find it, because of course, you're not really looking. You don't really want to know. You want to be fooled."
The only way to really describe this movie is that it is a magic trick. From top to bottom, it is a magic trick. And that's not an original observation by any means. It's actually exactly what the filmmakers were going for. Like how Memento played with your memory, the movie about magic tricks plays out like a magic trick. It lays out the first 2 acts and finally gives you the payoff once all is said and done, in a way that is immensely satisfying and surprising. So what's the story? Alfred Borden and Robert Angier are former friends turned bitter rivals. They worked together as stagehands until an accident or perhaps a mistake wound up killing Angier's wife. He blames Borden, who was the one who tied the knot that she could not escape from.
Which knot did you tie?
I'm sorry, I just don't know.
You don't know?
I'm sorry.
You don't know?
And as a result, the two embark on a quest to outdo each other, to discover the other's secrets, to create the perfect trick, and even plot revenge. Talk about extraordinary or even morally questionable choices. 2 men consumed by their rage towards each other that it becomes their obsession. All efforts are motivated by that simple quest of besting the other man. but you're following along at every step. And you have to be, because the movie throws a lot at you. It even asks right at the very beginning,
"Are you watching closely?"
This movie takes Nolan's penchant for non-linear storytelling to the extreme. We follow 4 different timelines, intercutting together across the 2-hour runtime. We have Angier reading Borden's diary, trying to uncover his secrets, and Borden reading Angier's diary, trying to do the same. And then the remaining 2 timelines are the contents of each, as we explore both men's stories as they read about each other, which might even give these sequences something of a subjective perspective. Is this really how it went down, or is it just the interpretation of the man reading it? All of this is intercut together, going back and forth throughout time at every turn, jumping across years to uncover the story piece by piece. Yet the movie never loses you. It might be jumping around, but it's always motivated. The editing, once again by Lee Smith, keeps things clear. We know where we are at every moment. Mainly because, for the most part, each individual story is playing out chronologically. We might be intercutting between different stories, but within each one, we know that one scene follows the next. And it also gives a sense of anticipation that might not have existed had the movie played out linearly. You know, it takes time to get to certain places and certain developments, which all come around to motivate the present story. Part of that is even helped by the music, once again composed by David Julian. It is in fact the last of Nolan's movies to feature Julian as a composer. This time, on top of the usual atmospheric work he had done before, they began honing in on a specific concept called the shepherd tone. An auditory illusion where it sounds like the music is constantly rising, yet it never gets out of reach. There's something unnerving about it, and it's used to create tension and anticipation as certain events build, which fits perfectly to a magician's act because you are always anticipating the final reveal. And the performances help bring it home. Both Christian Bale and Hugh Jackman are bringing their A game. Christian Bale is playing the more methodical, technical magician, while Hugh Jackman is the showman, the entertainer. He's not quite the greatest showman yet, but he is a showman. Michael Caine is great as ever, providing a bit of an emotional and moral anchor as the story continues. And David Bowie as Tesla is really quite fantastic. I mean, he really does bring that otherworldly energy that Nolan was looking for, especially during his introductory shot. A shot that also carries with it Batman Begins' penchant for the rule of cool. Andy Serkis is even in this movie a little bit, playing Tesla's ingenue Mr. Alley, and he's a lot of fun in the few scenes he has here. It's great. But at its core, this movie is about the devolving rivalry of 2 men. 2 men seeking to destroy each other. They manage to sabotage, trick, even maim. There's a bit where Angier manages to shoot off 2 of Borden's fingers early on, which even manages to continue to haunt him only a few days later.
I don't understand how it can be bleeding again. It's as bad as the day it happened.
But the question is, what are they truly after? Well, they're after the best trick, the transported man. Both men have a version of this trick. They will disappear through one door and emerge through the other door at an impossible distance in impossible time. How do they do it?
He uses a double.
No, that sounds far too simple. There's no way Borden can accomplish that with a double. It's the same person for sure. At least that's what Angier thinks. Yet he tries the double plan as well, meaning Hugh Jackman gets to take on dual roles for a bit. Not only playing Angier, but also Gerald Root, a drunk failed actor who takes on the role of the other Angier emerging from the door. Of course, a lot of this is seen through Angier's eyes, as he not only is relegated to being below stage as the audience cheers for his trick, but he also doesn't know how exactly Borden accomplishes his trick. There has to be something more to it, there has to be. Which leads him to Nikola Tesla, and his grand invention to create the best trick anyone has ever seen. Meanwhile, Borden is spying on Angier, even using his own ingenue Fallon to seek out Angier's secrets, or even manipulate his plans. It's with his help that they're able to sabotage Angier by getting to Gerald Root, suggesting he has more power than he might have been led to believe, which manages to completely upend Angier's act in the most embarrassing way.
And go easy on the poor chap. He does try so very hard.
But what the movie also explores is the consequences of this obsession, especially on Borden's end. Borden does manage to find a life for himself, marrying Sarah, having a daughter with her, but their relationship is split in half somehow. Sometimes he loves her, sometimes he doesn't.
Maybe today you're more in love with magic than me. I like being able to tell the difference. It makes the days it is true mean something.
Then there's Olivia, played by Scarlett Johansson, who winds up getting caught between both magicians, used as a spy to try and uncover the other's secrets. And she seems to fall in love with Borden, while Borden falls in love with her. It becomes very complicated. There's a lot of sacrifice, especially when feelings get involved, like living half a life. And the longer the movie goes, the harder it gets on everyone, especially Sarah, who is unable to cope with the days her husband doesn't love her.
I love you. I will always love you, and you alone.
You mean it today?
Absolutely.
Which makes it so much harder when you don't.
And in the end, she takes her own life. She isn't able to live the way Borden seems to be living, not with all the secrets and lies going around. Even Olivia leaves after all of that, not wanting to be part of the revenge quest despite her own feelings. The movie's all about how this kind of rivalry, this obsession for revenge, is ultimately destructive in every way. Any life Borden or Angier were able to grasp is torn away by their own choices. But that is not the magic trick. It might be the entire point of the movie, and it's most definitely a very good part of the movie, the thematic and moral center that carries the whole thing, but it's not the trick. The last 30 minutes of the movie reveal the trick. In fact, it reveals two tricks. The machine Tesla built Angier is actually a cloning machine, a replicator. They thought they were making a teleporter, and to some extent they were, but it replicates the host instead of transporting it. Hence the field of top hats. Step inside the machine and a complete replica of yourself will appear only a short distance away. But in this world, there's only room for one Angier, so the other kills him.
No, wait, I'm not...
Which inevitably becomes a ploy to frame Borden for his death, to sentence Borden to death as the ultimate show of revenge. Angier is now willing to get his hands dirty to not just best the competition, but remove it entirely. But that's where the other final trick is revealed. Borden is not just one man. He has a twin brother, which means Christian Bale is also playing dual roles throughout the movie. He is Borden, and he is also his ingénieur Fallon. But not all the time. They're constantly switching. They take turns, living half a life. One of them loves Sarah, the other doesn't. One of them loves Olivia, the other doesn't. Both statements are true because they're true for each person. And so, while Borden is sentenced to death, the other gets to survive. The one who loved Sarah, the mother of his child.
But you wouldn't clap yet, because making something disappear isn't enough. You have to bring it back.
That is the magic trick. And it's so satisfying because every single piece was laid out plain as day. The movie's not really making it a secret. It's not being subtle in any way. Cutter straight up says what the trick is at the beginning. It's a double. Angier, and by extension the audience, believe that that can't be it. That's far too simple. But that's just it. It is simple, but it's also complicated, difficult. Each one has to make the same sacrifices. Each one loses something along the way, be it physical or something they love. And this twist manages to reframe the entire story. Once you know the twist and you go back to watch the movie again, all of these details stick out clear as day. It feels so obvious, but that's what makes it a trick.
Now you're looking for the secret. But you won't find it because, of course, you're not really looking. You don't really want to work it out. You want to be fooled.
And that is the prestige, in more ways than one. This movie is fantastic. It really has it all. Intrigue, twists, emotion, magic, some cool stuff to cap it all off. I mean, you could argue that this might be Nolan's best movie ever. It's definitely a bit of a sleeper amongst his career. It's one people don't talk about as much, but it hits. Critical reception was also quite good. There were some criticisms towards Tesla's science fiction invention. Maybe that broke the barriers of reality a bit too much, but the movie continues to play it straight. And as a result, many more were completely taken into the story Nolan wanted to tell, and how it was adapted from Christopher Priest's novel. And despite box office tracking suggesting that this would be Nolan's first flop, it still managed to defy expectations. On a budget of $40 million, the movie managed to rake in $109 million worldwide. Not as much as Batman Begins, but it's hard to really expect that from a movie of this type. It still managed to break even. It opened at number 1 and managed to keep strong legs and good word of mouth to carry it across the finish line. What it really was proof that Christopher Nolan was here to stay. No matter the genre or time period, he'd find a way in that was surprising, unexpected, and unique. There was something to this guy. He constantly managed to drum out hits every time, even if some of his movies are better than others, and The Prestige was perhaps the greatest to do it so far. But of course, eyes were quickly on the horizon. This was a fantastic time at the movies, but people were looking out to the not-too-distant future, as audiences began waiting for Nolan to play the card he so effortlessly promised. In December of 2023, after the actors' strike had ended and promotional efforts for Oppenheimer hit a second wave, Cillian Murphy wound up doing a variety actors-on-actors interview with Margot Robbie. You know, combining the two faces of the 2023 summer movie season, the two faces of the Barbenheimer phenomenon into one place, and having them talk about movies for 45 minutes. But in that conversation, when talking about the two movies' shared release date, Cillian Murphy revealed that Nolan never wanted to move the release date of Oppenheimer, particularly because it landed on his lucky weekend. July 21st landed on the third weekend of July. It was the fifth of Nolan's movies to land on the third weekend of July. Tenet was gonna be released on that weekend before it was delayed, and next year's The Odyssey will also release on that same weekend. I find it interesting that there's just an ever so slight level of superstition to this, that Nolan believes in some way that a movie of his will do well because it lands on that weekend. It's tried and true. And I also think it's no coincidence that the first movie of his to release on the third weekend of July was The Dark Knight. The ending of Batman Begins laid out a promise for the future, and not just with the Joker card. Gordon himself says that Batman's very presence will lead to escalation. That right there is the line that would make the foundation of The Dark Knight, grappling with how Batman impacts the world. Now that he exists, what does that mean? Where does that lead? What is the logical endpoint of his existence? While the first movie was without a doubt a superhero origin story, Nolan made an effort to differentiate The Dark Knight from its predecessor. No doubt it would be darker, but also grander. The Dark Knight was going to take more cues from movies like Heat to become a crime drama. Only instead of Robert De Niro and Al Pacino at the center, it was Batman and the Joker. And as 2007 got underway and development continued, so did casting. Of course, plenty of people from the first movie were set to come back. Christian Bale, Michael Caine, Gary Oldman, Morgan Freeman, but they would also be joined by plenty of new faces, including Aaron Eckhart as Harvey Dent, also known as Two-Face, but on top of that, Maggie Gyllenhaal would join the project, filling in as Rachel Dawes. For one reason or another, be it her decision, the studio's decision, or Tom Cruise's decision, Katie Holmes would not return for the second Batman movie. But since Rachel was still set to have a role, it was filled by Maggie Gyllenhaal. The cast was even bigger than it had been for Batman Begins, featuring stars from across the industry. And once they had been assembled, they all gathered together for the start of principal photography, for the day the cameras would roll on The Dark Knight for the first time. There's a question regarding Christopher Nolan that's kind of hard to pin down with a precise answer. What is his style? Many directors have a look to them. They bring a certain flair to the visuals especially. David Lynch, Steven Spielberg, Sam Raimi, Michael Bay. You can look at anything they've worked on and tell, okay, yeah, that came from them, that was shot by them. And some of those things are really easy to define. The Spielberg long take, the Sam Raimi rapid dolly Dutch tilt, the Michael Bay long lens circling shot. But with Nolan, it's a little less clear. Whenever you see a shot from a Nolan movie, it's recognizable as being from Christopher Nolan, but figuring out why that is harder to nail down. But there are a couple of hallmarks, even if they're quite understated. For one thing, from the very beginning, Nolan has used a lot of handheld camera work. It was a necessity on following, but it became a distinct choice on movies like The Prestige or Oppenheimer. There's something messy or even chaotic about that, and it puts you right in the middle of the action with the characters. The other thing is natural lighting, which was also a necessity on following and became more of a choice in later movies. Shooting next to windows, outside, just getting the natural light from the sun or the sky to create the sequences. It also allows for more 360-degree sets because you don't have big lights everywhere that you have to frame out of the shot. You can just get in there and shoot what you need. I think also when it comes to general design philosophy, the movies are quite brutalist. Everything is very blocky, square, angular, from the towers of Gotham to the ships in Interstellar. I mean, Tars and Case are just big rectangles made up of smaller rectangles. That was a deliberate choice in the case of The Dark Knight. Since the Joker symbolized chaos and anarchy, everything on the hero side needed to be controlled and angular and very straightforward, visually representing order and chaos. Christopher Nolan himself has said that one of the goals of every one of his movies is to create a lot of texture in the locations or the sets. You know, Following might have been shot on a shoestring budget, but the detail and texture they could find in these places was quite something and made the movie look more expensive than it was. Nolan himself has even been quoted as saying that now, with unlimited resources, he's always trying to get the movies to go back to the era when they had nothing, creating that same texture he was able to find on a no-budget movie. These are the things that I think are quite consistent in Nolan's work so far, things that appear in each one of his movies. But there's also been an evolution. When he started, Nolan shot a lot of his sequences in close-up, getting right up next to the actors, in a way that even surprised actors like Al Pacino on Insomnia. He never expected the camera to get that close. And certainly that continued all the way through to Oppenheimer, which still puts the camera right next to the actor's face. But there was a change made over the years. As things evolved and as each movie continued, Nolan would start pulling the camera back, including more medium shots, more wide shots. You see more over time. And that is all due to IMAX. On April 13th, 2007, the cast and crew of The Dark Knight finally assembled for the beginning of principal photography. Like Batman Begins before it, The Dark Knight was being shot under a working title. This time, Rory's First Kiss. Why was that name significant? Well, because Rory is the name of one of Christopher Nolan and Emma Thomas's 4 children. It gave this movie a bit of a personal hook as production got underway. But in an expansion from Batman Begins, this would be the biggest movie Nolan had ever shot, working under the monstrous budget of $185 million. It's all about escalation. But the price tag wasn't the only thing that got bigger, because the filming format also took a leap as production kicked off. In 2005, a partnership began between Christopher Nolan and the people at IMAX as Batman Begins saw a brief release on the biggest screens around. It was part of a wave through the 2000s to bring more and more feature films to IMAX screens, after decades of either trimmed-down movies, short films, and documentaries. Now, once again, The Dark Knight would see a release in IMAX, but it would also take things a step further. For years, IMAX had been developing their very own film technology, their very own film cameras. Now, what makes an IMAX camera different from a standard 35mm camera? Well, it's bigger. It's a lot bigger. 35mm film is 35mm wide. You know, that makes sense. IMAX film, however, is 70mm wide, over double the width. But that's not all, because that just makes for large format film. That doesn't actually make it IMAX. Standard 70mm or 65mm film will run through a camera vertically, and each frame of film will span 5 perforations, or 5 perfs along the side. That's already quite substantial. But if you run the film through the camera horizontally, you can now get a single frame of film that is 15 perforations wide. You can get an image that's 3 times the size of a large format frame. So IMAX was building cameras that could run 70mm film horizontally through the camera to create the most breathtaking shots you could ever see. It was used plenty of times for experimental films, shorts, and documentaries, but never for a major feature film. But Christopher Nolan quickly fell in love with it. The image quality was more crisp and clear than anything he'd shot before. There was a grandness of scope that IMAX allowed, and even a whole new way to perceive movies. It opened new doors never thought possible. To him, IMAX is the greatest film format ever created, and the closest we've ever gotten to replicating how the human eye really sees. So, The Dark Knight, on top of filming primarily with 35mm film, would be the very first feature film to utilize IMAX cameras. 6 select sequences would be filmed with this technology, making them some of the biggest film sequences of all time. Nolan would even say he wished he could shoot the entire movie like this. Of course, money would be an object, this stuff isn't cheap, but it was also quite loud. Since the film is so big and running through 24 frames a second, it sounds like a lawnmower going off on set. It's hard to capture clear dialogue when that thing's going off. So most of the shooting for IMAX was relegated to a few action sequences, showing off the scale on some of the biggest aspects of the movie. The Dark Knight mostly filmed in and around Chicago, taking a page out of Batman Begins' book to use the city as a placeholder for Gotham. Only this time there'd be little adjustment to make the city more fantastical. Chicago was going to be Gotham, using its sea of skyscrapers to make Gotham look enormous and imposing. There were tons of practical effects on Showcase as well. Despite the bigger price tag, Nolan did not want to rely on digital effects more than he did last time. In fact, he decided to rely on them less. There were insane stunts like a truck flip, and an entire building was demolished, engulfed in flame for what promised to be a major sequence, images of which easily made their way online. But for the most part, outside of some big city shooting that was going to make it online no matter what you did, most of the movie was able to be kept under wraps, with only scarce looks at some of the characters like the Joker, which fans were very interested in. But the marketing push for The Dark Knight would get started in no time. In fact, it would get started with something you rarely ever see in big blockbusters. The team behind The Dark Knight employed the team at 42 Entertainment to create an alternate reality game, or ARG. They were actually the ones behind the I Love Bees campaign from Halo 2. This allowed fans to interact with websites and get directly involved, all to lead towards real, tangible reveals surrounding the movie. It started with a quick email form that revealed the very first image of the Joker, and continued from there to a scavenger hunt all across Comic-Con. Following the clues would not only lead to this image, but also to the very first teaser trailer.
Starting tonight, people will die. I'm a man of my word.
While simply a shattering Batman insignia, the voiceover, the reveal of the Joker's voice, the music, it all hit with a slam. And the fact that it was the result of hard work by those at Comic-Con, that just made it all the more rewarding. After months of shooting across 2007, eventually production turned away from Chicago and went to Hong Kong, journeying to the other side of the world for a major sequence, also shot with IMAX cameras, which led to the end of principal photography on November 15th, 2007, wrapping the longest and largest production of Christopher Nolan's career, one with more eyes on it than any other. With the conclusion of filming, the marketing campaign only began to skyrocket, with more games hitting the internet, more scavenger hunts, more clues. This time, they all led to something even bigger than the initial teaser. They all led a select few fans to 5 theater locations, 4 in the US, the last one in Toronto. Let's go Canada. Here they would get to see the opening sequence for The Dark Knight in IMAX, which would then see a wide release playing in front of IMAX showings of I Am Legend, a promotional tie-in that had never really been seen before. I mean, an entire scene from another movie before this movie? That's crazy. But it's The Dark Knight, so I'm not complaining. This sequence, of course, was the heist sequence introducing the Joker, featuring twists, turns, sabotage, double crosses, and some phenomenal line readings.
You have any idea who you're stealing from? You and your friends are dead!
And of course, it all built into the reveal of the Joker himself. A tangled web of twists led to his startling reveal, absolutely proving to everyone that Heath Ledger was right for the role. That proof only continued shortly after with the release of the second teaser trailer. Set to the pulsating beats of Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard's score, this trailer showed off so much more than the previous teaser. It showed off some actual footage. Action, spectacle, the whole 9 yards are on display here. But the real showstopper is the Joker himself. Many were skeptical after it was announced he was cast, but this proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Heath Ledger could pull it off. What started as a bit of apprehension soon turned into excitement. He was the single most anticipated aspect of the movie in what was sure to be the single most anticipated movie of 2008.
Come on, hit me! Let's put a smile on that face.
But unfortunately, tragedy would strike in the early weeks of 2008. Because on January 22nd, the news broke that Heath Ledger had died from an apparent overdose in his apartment. This was an absolute shock to the industry, and especially to the crew who worked on this movie. It seemed by all accounts that Christopher Nolan really enjoyed working with Heath Ledger, which could also be gathered by his own article celebrating his life and his time with him. But it also led to a commitment that his performance would not be altered to change Ledger's intention. What he did in the movie would stick. What his role was going to stay exactly as it was meant to be. This did have a bit of an impact on the promotional side of things, as the viral marketing campaign shifted gears away from the Joker to instead focus on Harvey Dent. Real-life campaign stops, banners, buttons. Aaron Eckhart himself even appeared at campaign rallies in character as Harvey Dent. It was crazy. Websites would pop up online, allowing people to engage with Gotham in any way they chose, chronicling an additional story set before the events of the movie, even thematically tying in. But the Joker would still have a presence, as another series of scavenger hunts would lead to the discovery of the second full trailer. Though not a very pristine trailer, it was scratched up and scarred by the Joker, with crazed markings all across, even ending the trailer with The Dork Knight instead of The Dark Knight. That Joker guy, I don't know what to tell you, but he's pretty funny. This, of course, would not be the only version of the trailer, as the full, unmarked version would be released online shortly after.
This city deserves a better class of criminal. I'm gonna give it to him. No!
The promotional push for The Dark Knight wasn't just the biggest of Nolan's career, it was one of the most unique promotional pushes for any movie ever. I mean, engaging fans worldwide in scavenger hunts, online games, participating in the world of Gotham, even uncovering 6 Gotham City news reports on various topics leading right up to the events of the movie. There was honestly nothing quite like The Dark Knight. Its presence was unavoidable. Everyone knew this movie was coming. Everyone was aware of it on some level. And for a great many of those people, they were absolutely thrilled to see it for themselves. After early reviews were nothing but positive about the movie, fans and audiences became confident that Nolan had captured lightning in a bottle once again. After 10 years since the release of his very first feature film, here was Christopher Nolan on the world stage for the most anticipated movie of 2008. 3 years had passed since Batman flipped over that playing card, since audiences were introduced to this new Nolanized version of his world, and it was time to see it continue. The world premiere was held in New York City on July 14th, 2008, followed by the wide release just 4 days later. So prepare yourselves. The clock has now turned to July 18th, 2008. Head over to your nearest theater and book your tickets for an IMAX showing, because it's now time to see what Christopher Nolan has cooked up for his very first sequel. It's hard to get bigger than this. The Dark Knight, despite its lengthy 2.5-hour runtime, is a movie that moves at an absolute clip. It hardly gives you any time to breathe as it rockets from one set piece to another, methodically setting up each piece only for the Joker to subsequently destroy them in his quest for anarchy and chaos in Gotham. It's a roller coaster unlike anything Nolan's done in his career so far. It's also entirely linear. There are no flashbacks, no out-of-order narratives, it's all played in chronological order, which in some ways makes this Nolan's most traditional movie. But some of his defining hallmarks still make their way in, and some new ones get some developments at the same time, like cross-cutting. Now, we'd seen some cross-cutting in some movies before, but it's all over this one. Multiple times during the movie, scenes will be intercut together, all as a way of creating tension and momentum for key junctures in the story. But it's also all built around the Shepard tone. Now, I mentioned that this was used for the music in The Prestige, but it's brought to even greater use here. The Shepard tone is essentially 3 chords playing simultaneously that are always rising. However, while the middle remains at a consistent volume, the higher one is slowly fading out and the lower one is slowly fading in, meaning you can repeat this endlessly to create the sound of constant building. The Dark Knight manages to use this in 2 ways. For one thing, it's used for the sound of the bat pod. You know, that thing never shifts down, it's always rising. But it's also worked into the cross-cut sequences. I mean, more often than not, these sequences feature 3 intercutting threads. One is kind of at a consistent pace, the other is reaching its crescendo, and the third is just getting started. It takes what is really an auditory illusion and turns it into a visual experience that you feel right into your core. That's what makes these sequences hit. That's what helps capture the tension, and that's what makes the release of said tension so extraordinary, even if it ends in chaos and disharmony. The music is also even heavier and more percussive than ever before. Hans Zimmer and James Newton Howard worked together to create a score that one might even call assaultive. It's almost never letting up, constantly propelling the story forward. But then comes the biggest leap in this movie: IMAX. One could argue that the use of IMAX here is the single biggest technological leap Nolan's ever undertaken, shooting on the largest imaging format and presenting the movie on the biggest screens around. 6 select sequences were shot entirely in IMAX. The opening heist, the raid in Hong Kong, the truck chase, which is fantastic, the hospital sequence, the final action sequence in the Pruitt building, and the epilogue, with occasional additional IMAX shots here and there, either for brief key moments or even establishing shots, showing off the grandeur of Gotham in a way never seen before. All in all, IMAX footage appears for 28 of the movie's 152 minutes, which might not sound like a lot, but the impact it has cannot be understated. While most of Nolan's previous movies were shot primarily in close-ups, this movie pulls back a little bit. Wider shots, more medium angles, shots last longer, they linger more, and it especially impacts the action. The action this time is quite a bit clearer than it was before. While there's still some emphasis on the chaos and pure visceral feeling of the action, the cutting is way less frequent than it was before, mainly because any of the quick-cut action scenes of his previous movies would really just become mud on an enormous IMAX screen. So those instincts have to be reeled back so that you can still tell what's going on even when it's 50 feet tall. It even gives more weight and power to some of the standout practical stunts in this movie. Nolan's penchant for filming as much in camera as possible comes through with not one but 2 stunning moments. The first comes at the close of an enormous chase scene. There's plenty of great gags in here. The Tumbler gets plenty of moments to shine, and it even features the reveal of the Bat Pod. Once again, Batman gets to be cool. But it all reaches ahead for the truck flip, a shot captured in real time on camera in IMAX film for the audience's enjoyment. And let me tell you, it kinda sorta takes your breath away. All of the sound cuts out and there's no music. It really does capture the effect of someone holding their breath, which makes it really easy for an audience member to hold their breath. The other moment comes only about 30 minutes later, with the entirely practical destruction of Gotham General Hospital. People, of course, had seen glimpses of this stunt before, it was hard to hide it, but once it was shown off in IMAX, dude. But even with all of those gags, the fun gadgets, the new tools and tricks, like its predecessor, the thing that really sticks out for this movie is the story. It's a story filled with plenty of twists and turns. I mean, Gordon fakes his death at one point only to return at a pivotal moment to stop the Joker, which even earns him the title of Commissioner. And of course, the following twist of the Joker getting caught on purpose as part of a larger ruse. To pull the two-time like that, two major twists right after each other, right when you think you have the movie pegged, it throws you for another loop. But at its core, this story is all about escalation. Escalation centering around the Joker himself, a character who is without a doubt Nolan's greatest villain ever. He's a villain filled with nihilistic glee. He wants to see the collapse of everything around him in large part because he thinks it's funny. Upsetting the established order is funny. Being the ultimate foil for Batman is funny. And he himself gets to generate some laughs. I mean, there's the pencil trick, there's his reaction to how many people he's killed, his tricks that he'll pull on everyone else in the movie, and this bit.
You think you can steal from us and just walk away?
Yeah.
The Joker propels the entire movie, hands down making him its greatest aspect. I mean, the performance, the terrifying nature of him, his quest for destruction and chaos. Christopher Nolan and Heath Ledger really tapped into something here. There's a reason this performance and this character still manages to resonate after all of this time. He's really a one-of-a-kind force. A force that constantly puts Batman and the city into moral dilemmas. Save Rachel or save Harvey? Save Reese or save a hospital? Do the people on the boats kill each other to save themselves? And not all of these land for the better, because in a shocking twist against convention, Rachel Dawes is blown sky high. It's on one hand incredibly shocking for Batman himself, putting Bruce Wayne in perhaps the lowest spot he's ever been in, but it's also impactful on the other standout aspect of the movie, Harvey Dent. In a lot of ways, this is Harvey Dent's movie. He's Gotham's White Knight, a hero with a face who can put the mob away and clean up the city once and for all. But he has a dark side. When put under pressure, his anger can rise to the surface. His choices can become significantly more questionable. The good guy front can easily be stripped away. And the Joker knows this, very deliberately pulling at Dent's strings until the ultimate moment when he kills Rachel. Which also leaves Dent himself burned half to hell. He is Harvey Dent no longer. Now, he is Two-Face. Which all leads to the final scene. While the Joker is ultimately defeated, he manages to play his one final card. Harvey Dent is holding Gordon's family hostage, and it's up to Batman and Gordon to stop him before things go from bad to worse. It's interesting to watch because the hint of Dent's fall were all very clearly hinted at throughout the movie. You might not be thinking about it on a first run-through, but once his descent is clear, you can really see the work put in by the filmmakers to earn this turn to darkness. And it ultimately leads to an enormous sacrifice, as Batman more or less kills Harvey to save Gordon's son. And following that, he decides to take the fall for all of the damage Harvey has caused. Harvey's reputation has to survive. He must remain as Gotham's White Knight, leaving Batman to become the city's pariah. Because, as the movie says on multiple occasions,
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
what this gives us is a final cross-cut montage, all shot in IMAX, where each of the story's threads come together for a resounding conclusion. Every character gets one final moment as the narration from Batman and Jim Gordon sells the final message the movie has to offer. It is the first major instance of Nolan using a cross-cut montage to put the final pieces in place, but it works spectacularly well, giving the movie one last somewhat heroic, somewhat tragic note, all joined together by Gordon's final narration.
He's a silent guardian, a watchful protector, a dark knight.
And with that title slam, the movie comes to a close, with all of the thematic resonance hitting like a brick wall. The Dark Knight is easily the biggest, boldest, and in many ways best movie Nolan has made so far. Complete with interesting moral dilemmas, thematic ideas, stellar performances, and plenty of things to keep you thinking long after you leave the theater. I mean, Cillian Murphy even shows up as Scarecrow for a minute at the start. Like, we really have everything here. It's deeply thrilling, totally intense, and it looks incredible. And let me tell you, audiences and critics were floored. Virtually every review for the movie was insanely positive, singing all of the movie's praises until the cows come home. From the visuals to Heath Ledger's performance, all of it hit extraordinarily well, and audiences couldn't get enough. The Dark Knight managed to completely shock the box office with an insane $158 million opening weekend, making it the biggest opening weekend ever at the time of its release. And it hardly slowed down, continuing its dominance for months in theaters, ultimately raking in $533 million domestically and cracking a whopping $1 billion worldwide, making this the fourth movie ever to crack $1 billion at the worldwide box office. The Dark Knight dominated the summer of 2008. It was the most anticipated movie of the year and the most talked about movie after its release, with many people quoting tons of lines from across its runtime. Namely,
because he's the hero Gotham deserves, but not the one it needs right now.
And at the start of the new year, the movie even made a splash at the Oscars, being nominated for a grand total of 8 awards, and coming home with 2 of them. One award was given to Richard King for Best Sound Editing, and the other was posthumously awarded to Heath Ledger for Best Supporting Actor, an award accepted on his behalf by his family. There was a bit of a stink around the fact that the movie wasn't nominated for Best Picture, however, which actually led to a change in the rules from the Academy. In all years prior, the Best Picture category only ever included 5 nominations, like every other category. But after this, that number could go up to 10, meaning more movies like The Dark Knight could find their way into the running for the most prestigious award in Hollywood. The Dark Knight's legacy is honestly kind of insane. Its influence is really unmatched. I mean, so many movies have tried to ape off the tone, music, and even story beats that this movie established. I mean, how many movies have tried the whole bad guy gets himself captured on purpose thing? But even more significantly than that, this movie made Christopher Nolan into a household name. If Batman Begins hadn't already done that, this movie definitely did. Suddenly, everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew his reputation for dark, thrilling, and thematically resonant stories. This was the culmination of Nolan's rise over the last 10 years. He had gone from an indie filmmaker trying to get his movie in front of an audience to a blockbuster director responsible for one of the biggest movies of all time. It was a meteoric rise to stardom, and it put him in a very unique position that most only dream of. While many people immediately wanted him to return to Gotham for a third Batman movie to see where this story would go from here, the success of this movie also left some other equally interesting promising prospects. Nolan essentially had a blank check to continue making the movies he wanted to make. So while returning to Gotham was likely inevitable, there was going to be room to do something before that. Perhaps with this unprecedented success in the film industry, it was time for Nolan to tackle one of his original ideas. Perhaps it was time for him to tackle his dream project.